deep inside a cave in northern Spain, on a wall that hasn't seen sunlight in tens of thousands of years. There are marks. Red ochre shapes, ladders, dots, geometric lines, painted directly onto the rock. Nothing unusual about that. Cave art is famous. We know about it. Lascaux, Altamira, the great galleries of human prehistory. Except these marks aren't from humans, or at least, they weren't made by us. The dating technology used to analyse them came back with a number that stopped researchers cold. Over 64,000 years old, modern humans weren't even in Europe yet. Homo sapiens wouldn't arrive on that continent for another 20,000 years. So who made them? Who climbed into the darkness, ground red pigment from iron-rich rock, and pressed it against a cave wall before we even existed in that part of the world? The answer that the evidence keeps pointing toward is Neanderthals. And that answer changes almost everything we thought we understood about the story of the human mind. Here's what makes this genuinely strange. For most of modern science's history, Neanderthals were cast as the supporting characters of human evolution. The also-rans. Stocky, strong, smart enough to survive ice ages, but not quite bright enough to do what we do. Not quite capable of the leap into symbolic thought, into art, into meaning-making. That was our thing. Our special trick. The cognitive revolution that supposedly separated Homo sapiens from every other species that ever walked this planet. Except now, carved into cave walls and buried in archaeological sediment across Europe. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that Neanderthals were doing something that looks an awful lot like art. Not just once, not in one location, but repeatedly in multiple places across tens of thousands of years. 20,000 years before the first modern human picked up a piece of ochre and left a handprint anywhere on Earth. So the question isn't just whether Neanderthals made art. The evidence for that is building to a point where serious researchers are taking it very seriously. The deeper question, the one that's genuinely hard to answer, is what were they trying to say? When a Neanderthal descended into a dark cave with a handful of red pigment and a torch that barely pushed back the shadows, what were they thinking? What were they feeling? Were they communicating something to someone else? Were they doing something spiritual? Something social? Something we don't even have a good category for? That's what we're going to try to understand today. Before we go any further, where are you right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely check them. It's one of my favourite things. Yesterday it was Stockholm at 2 in the morning, Cape Town at lunch, and someone in Seoul who said they've been listening for 6 months straight and never commented once. Tonight's your night. Tell me where you are, and if you want to listen without any interruptions, no ads, no music underneath the narration, just the story, you can follow this show on Spotify. The link is in the description. It's free. It helps the work continue, and honestly, the listening experience is just cleaner. Now, here's what this video is not going to do. It's not going to hand you a tidy conclusion and tell you that yes, Neanderthals definitely had rich inner lives and were basically just like us with different foreheads. It's also not going to dismiss the evidence and tell you the whole thing is overblown, because neither of those things is honest. The truth is that we are in the middle of an ongoing scientific debate, one that is genuinely unsettled, and the most interesting place to be in any field of knowledge is right in the middle of a question that hasn't been answered yet. So what we're going to do is look at the evidence carefully. We'll examine what researchers have found, how they dated it, and what the most credible skeptical arguments are, because there are good ones. We'll sit with the ambiguity instead of rushing past it. And we'll let the mystery do what mysteries are supposed to do, which is make you think. We're going to travel to a handful of pivotal sites. A cave in Mercia, where shells were found stained with pigment, suggesting Neanderthals were using colour as decoration on their bodies or objects long before they painted walls. Cueva de los Aviones, Cueva de Ardeles, La Pasiega, places where the red and black marks on the stone are old enough to rewrite the timeline if the dating holds up. And we'll look at what each site adds to the picture, because no single discovery proves anything on its own. It's the accumulation, the pattern, the fact that similar behaviours keep appearing in different places separated by geography and time, that starts to feel like something more than coincidence. We'll also dig into the question of what even counts as art in the first place. This turns out to be a genuinely complicated philosophical problem, not just an archaeological one. Because if art requires intention, what level of intention? If it requires symbolic thought, how do we detect symbolic thought in the archaeological record? A straight line scratched into rock could be a doodle, a territorial mark, a record of something, a decoration, or just what happens when someone drags a sharp stone across a surface without thinking about it at all. The difference between those possibilities matters enormously, and figuring out which explanation fits the evidence is harder than it sounds. And then there's the bigger question underneath all of it. If Neanderthals were capable of this, of pigment use, of ornamentation, of descending into lightless caves to make marks on walls, what does that do to our understanding of what makes a mind modern? We've built a lot of our self-concept as a species on the idea that we're the ones who make meaning. The ones who tell stories, who decorate our world, who think about thinking. But what if that capacity is older than us? What if it didn't originate with Homo sapiens, but was already there, running quietly in a species we've spent 2 centuries underestimating? That's not a comfortable question, which is usually a sign it's the right one to ask. There's a message on a cave wall in Spain that is 64,000 years old. Nobody put it there to be found. Nobody who made it knew that one day a species would evolve with instruments precise enough to date it, with technology sophisticated enough to photograph it, and with enough curiosity to crawl through the dark trying to understand what it means. But it's there, waiting. And it has been waiting for a very long time. Let's try to figure out what it's saying. So before we look at any specific cave or any specific find, we need to wrestle with a problem that runs underneath this entire conversation. A problem that sounds simple until you actually try to solve it. What is art? Not in the philosophical sense, not in the gallery sense, but in the archaeological sense. When you're looking at something made by hands that have been dust for 60,000 years, when the person who made it left no writing, no testimony, no explanation, how do you decide whether what you're looking at was meaningful? How do you tell the difference between a mark someone made because it meant something to them, and a mark someone made because they were scraping grit off a rock surface? This is not a trivial question. It's actually one of the central problems in the study of deep prehistory, and researchers argue about it constantly, which is exactly what you want researchers to do. Because the answer you give to this question determines which evidence you accept and which evidence you dismiss. And that shapes the entire story. Let's start with the categories, because they matter. Archaeologists tend to break this territory into a few distinct concepts that often get collapsed together, but shouldn't be. There's art in the narrow sense, representational images, pictures of animals, humans, plants, things that look like something specific in the world. Then there's decoration, modifying an object or a surface to make it visually different from its unmodified state, not necessarily as a picture of anything, just as a change. Then there's symbolic behaviour, using an object or a mark or a substance to stand for something beyond itself, to carry meaning that exists in the mind rather than the material. And then there's utilitarian marking, scratches and lines that serve a practical function like counting, tracking or recording without any intent to communicate or express. These categories don't always stay neatly separated. A tally mark might start as utilitarian and end up symbolic. A decoration might carry social meaning that makes it symbolic even though it doesn't look like anything representational. The lines blur constantly. But the distinctions still matter, because they're making different claims about cognitive complexity. Here's the hardest part. intent. To call something art in any meaningful sense, you need some evidence of intention. Somebody had to choose to make it, had to put effort into it that went beyond what was strictly necessary for survival, had to have some purpose, even if we can't know what that purpose was. And intent is almost impossible to prove archaeologically. You can't dig up a mind. You can only dig up objects and surfaces and residues and then argue about what they imply. So researchers have developed a set of indirect criteria for inferring intent, and it's worth understanding what those criteria actually are, because they're the lens through which all of this evidence gets evaluated. One is repetition. If the same thing keeps appearing in different places, made by different individuals at different times, that suggests it wasn't random. Random scratches don't converge on consistent forms. Repetition implies either learning, tradition, or communication, all of which require intention. Another is standardization. This goes beyond repetition. It's not just that the same thing appears again and again, but that it appears in the same form with the same proportions, the same basic structure. Standardization suggests a mental template, a shared idea about what the thing is supposed to look like. That's a sophisticated cognitive operation. Then there's what researchers call non-utilitarian placement. If you find marks in a location that serves no practical purpose, deep inside a cave where no one would stumble across them by accident, on a surface too high to reach without effort, in a spot with no obvious functional value, that placement is itself evidence of intent. Something drove that behavior beyond simple necessity. And then there's the concept of costly signaling. This comes from evolutionary biology originally. The idea is that if an organism is spending significant time, energy, and resources on a behavior that doesn't directly contribute to survival, there's probably a reason rooted in communication or social signaling. Grinding ochre takes time and effort. Descending deep into a dangerous cave with a torch takes time and effort and real risk. Perforating a shell to hang it as an ornament takes deliberate skill. When we see this kind of investment in something non-utilitarian, it pushes against the explanation of accident or mindless behavior. But here's where we have to be careful. All of these criteria are filtered through a modern human mind. When we decide what counts as repetitive enough, what counts as standardized enough, what counts as sufficiently non-utilitarian, we're making those judgments from inside our own cognitive and cultural framework. And that framework carries enormous biases. The history of archaeology has several uncomfortable examples of researchers looking at Neanderthal behavior and setting the threshold for meaningful just slightly above whatever Neanderthals were found to be doing. Find ochre in Neanderthal sites. Well, it could be functional, perhaps used as a preservative for hides. Find shells, maybe they were collecting them for food, and the perforations are from natural wear. Find geometric marks, possibly just tool-sharpening byproducts. Every piece of evidence met with a more parsimonious explanation, and that's scientifically reasonable to a point. Parsimony matters, but there's a version of it that crosses over into motivated skepticism, where we're not really applying the same standard we'd apply if the same evidence showed up in a site firmly attributed to modern humans. There's also a deeper bias in what kinds of things we even recognize as art to begin with. We have a tendency to privilege representational imagery because it maps most cleanly onto our own conception of what art looks like. A bison painted on a cave wall reads as art immediately. A series of red dots or a row of scratched lines is harder for us to process as meaningful because it doesn't look like anything we recognize. But plenty of human artistic traditions, including many recent ones, are almost entirely non-representational. Geometric patterns, abstract markings, arrangements of colour and form that carry meaning within a cultural context, without depicting anything from the visible world. Our bias toward representation is a cultural bias, not a universal truth about what meaning looks like. This brings us to what will be two running lanes throughout this video. The first is representational imagery, the painted shapes in caves, the figures and forms that look like they're trying to picture something. This is the evidence that hits hardest emotionally, because it speaks directly to our familiar understanding of art. The second is abstract marks and material symbolism. The pigment use, the geometric engravings, the decorated shells and feathers, and ochre-stained objects. This is harder to interpret, but in some ways even more interesting, because it suggests a capacity for symbolic thought that doesn't depend on the ability to draw recognizable pictures. You can believe that meaning matters without being able to paint a mammoth. Both lanes lead toward the same fundamental question, which is whether the beings who left these traces were doing something that required a kind of mind we thought was exclusive to us. One more thing worth establishing before we get into specific evidence. For this video, we're going to treat art as a spectrum rather than a binary switch that gets flipped at some threshold. The traditional model in archaeology had a clear dividing line, usually called behavioural modernity, before which there was no symbolic behaviour worth taking seriously, and after which there was the full flowering of human cognitive complexity. That line was placed somewhere around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, conveniently coinciding with the explosion of cave paintings in Europe that we've known about the longest. But that model is under serious pressure now. Not because the paintings at Lascaux and Altamira are less impressive than we thought, they are extraordinary, but because evidence of symbolic behaviour keeps appearing earlier and earlier in the record. It appears in Africa 80,000 or even 100,000 years ago. It appears in association with Neanderthals in Europe. The line isn't holding, and when a line in science stops holding, the right response isn't to keep defending the line. It's to start asking whether the line was the right framework to begin with. So we're going to work with a gradient instead. At one end, behaviours that require very little inference to call symbolic. At the other end, behaviours that might have alternative explanations, but that fit a pattern of evidence pointing toward intentional meaning-making. And we're going to be honest about where each piece of evidence sits on that gradient rather than forcing everything into one category or the other. Because the most important thing we can do when looking at 64,000-year-old marks on a cave wall is resist the urge to decide what they are before we've actually looked at them carefully. That urge, the desire for a clean answer, is very human, and ironically, it might be exactly the thing that's been keeping us from understanding the full story of what it means to be human in the first place. To even start placing Neanderthal marks on that spectrum, we need to know who we're dealing with. Not the cartoon caveman with a club over his shoulder, but the actual population that lived and suffered and solved problems in real environments for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals show up in the fossil record as a distinct lineage roughly 400,000 years ago, probably emerging from a common ancestor shared with us somewhere in Eurasia. For most of their history, they occupied Europe and Western Asia, from Britain and France in the west, all the way to Siberia and the Levant in the east. They lived through repeated ice ages and short, unstable warm periods. Think less snowy postcard, and more violently shifting climates, with glaciers advancing and retreating, forests turning to steppe and back again, animals migrating in and out in massive pulses. They weren't living in one single environment. Some groups hunted in open, windy mammoth steppe. Others occupied dense, cold forests. Some seasons would have been brutally dry, others wet and muddy. Temperatures could swing wildly across the year. Neanderthal bodies tell that story. Short, stocky builds that conserve heat, barrel-shaped chests, powerful limbs, big noses and sinuses, likely adapted for warming frigid air. These weren't failed humans, these were specialists, fine-tuned for a Eurasian Ice Age world. And specialists don't survive on brute strength alone. They survive with technology. The old stereotype was that Neanderthals had simple tools, while modern humans had complex ones. That picture has not aged well across Europe and Western Asia. Neanderthal sites show a long-running technological tradition, sometimes labelled the Mousterian. That word covers a huge variety of stone tools, carefully shaped scrapers for working hides, points and blades for cutting and piercing, denticulates with serrated edges, specialized tools for woodworking and butchery. This wasn't random napping. Many Neanderthal groups used prepared core techniques like levallois, where you invest a lot of thought up front shaping a block of stone so that one controlled strike produces a flake of a very particular size and shape. That requires planning, three-dimensional visualization, and an internal template of what you're trying to make. And they didn't do it once. They did it again and again, in site after site, over tens of thousands of years. Their hunting strategies matched that level of deliberate skill. Evidence from cut marks, fracture patterns on bones, and the kinds of animals found at Neanderthal sites points to close-range, high-risk hunting of large game, bison, horses, red deer, sometimes even mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. In many cases, the carcasses look like they were brought back to living sites and systematically processed. That implies coordination. You don't bring down a 2-ton animal by yourself with a thrusting spear. Those spears, by the way, were not just sharpened sticks. In multiple sites, stone points show wear consistent with being hafted onto wooden shafts. Adhesive residues suggest they used complex glues made from plant resins or birch bark tar, which itself requires controlled heating in low oxygen conditions. That's chemistry, not in a lab coat sense, but in the sense of understanding that if you treat a material in a particular way, under particular conditions, you transform it into something new and useful. Fire use fits the same pattern. Neanderthals weren't just opportunistically grabbing torches from natural wildfires. Many sites show repeated controlled hearths with different layers of ash over time. Some contain burned bone and plant remains that suggest they were cooking food, not just warming themselves. There are hints that they managed fuel carefully, using different woods for different purposes. In a few sites, there's evidence they maintained fires through cold seasons instead of constantly starting from scratch, which is a subtle but important behavioral difference. A kept fire is a planned fire. As for shelters, Neanderthals certainly used caves, but they didn't rely on them exclusively. Archaeologists have found traces of built structures, circular arrangements of stones, post holes, even large accumulations of mammoth bones and tusks that may have formed the framework of windbreaks or huts. Combine that with evidence of hide-working tools, and you start seeing winter camps, not just random sleeping spots. You see people modifying their immediate environment to make it more habitable. Taken together, this already tells us something important about their minds. You don't get standardized tools, complex adhesives, cooperative big game hunts, and long-term fire management without social learning. Individuals had to watch others, imitate them, remember multi-step procedures, and pass them on in ways that preserve the key details. We see this in the archaeological record as technological traditions. Within a region, Neanderthal groups tend to share similar methods of making particular tools. Those methods can remain stable for thousands of years, and then you see innovations appear and spread. New point forms, new combinations of stone and organic components, new ways of organizing a toolkit. That kind of patterned change is very hard to explain without teaching. Not just monkey see, monkey do, but instruction, correction, apprenticeship. Planning depth shows up in other places too. Some sites contain stone raw materials that come from tens of kilometers away, implying intentional movement to specific quarries or the existence of exchange networks between groups. Some hunting sites seem seasonal, used at particular times of year to intercept migrating herds. That means somebody was thinking about time, about where animals would be, not just now, but weeks or months from now. What about their social lives? Here the evidence gets more indirect, but some of it is surprisingly intimate. Several Neanderthal skeletons show serious injuries or disabilities that had healed long before death. One famous example from Shanidar Cave in Iraq appears to have had a withered arm, significant vision impairment, and limited mobility, yet lived for decades. Another individual from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France was elderly, with severe arthritis and tooth loss. People like this do not survive in a world of big game hunting unless someone is helping them, sharing food, offering protection, possibly modifying tasks so they can still contribute. Now we have to be cautious. A few individuals do not automatically prove universal compassion or elaborate nursing care. Some injuries could have been less debilitating than they look in the bones, but the pattern across multiple sites is hard to ignore. It suggests that Neanderthal groups tolerated and even supported members who were not at peak physical capacity. That alone places them solidly within the range of what we would call human social behaviour. Burials add another layer and another set of arguments. At sites like Chanidar, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and others, Neanderthal bodies appear to have been placed intentionally in pits or depressions rather than left to be scattered by scavengers. In some cases, the bodies are in flexed positions that don't look like random collapse. A few sites have been claimed to show grave goods or even flowers, though those interpretations are heavily debated and some have been walked back. There's a spectrum of possible readings here. At the minimal end, deliberate burial could be about hygiene and carnivore control, get the corpse out of the way before it attracts predators or disease. At the other end, it could reflect ritual, belief about an afterlife, or a sense that the dead individual retains some social significance. We don't know where Neanderthals fell on that spectrum, but the moment you're taking the time and effort to dig a pit and arrange a body, you're already operating in a space where the dead matter to the living in more than a purely mechanical way. All of this circles back to a central question: how close were Neanderthal minds to ours? Did they speak? Could they think in symbols? Anatomically, they were much closer to us in this respect than older depictions suggested. Their hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the tongue and helps with speech, looks essentially like ours in at least one well-preserved specimen. Reconstructions of their vocal tract suggest they could produce a wide range of sounds, not exactly identical to modern human speech, but certainly not limited to grunts. Inner ear anatomy points to sensitivity in the same frequency ranges that human speech typically occupies. Genetically, we know that Neanderthals shared with us key variants of genes associated with language and speech, like FOXP2. That does not mean they had language in the full modern sense. Genes are not destiny, and FOXP2 is involved in many processes. But it undermines the idea that there was some simple genetic switch for language that they lacked. The flip side is that anatomy and genetics can't tell us about grammar, narrative, metaphor, jokes. Those things don't fossilize. What we can say is that Neanderthals had the hardware, and at least some of the genetic software compatible with complex vocal communication. When you combine that with the behavioral evidence, planned hunts, teaching, technological traditions, long-distance raw material transport, it becomes very hard to imagine them coordinating all of that with nothing more than a few yelps and gestures. So when we ask whether Neanderthals could engage in symbolic behavior, whether pigments and engravings and cave marks associated with them might have meant something, we're not starting from zero. We're not asking whether a completely alien hominin suddenly woke up one day and decided to make art. We're looking at a lineage that survived in harsh, variable environments for hundreds of thousands of years using flexible technology, social learning, cooperation, and probably rich vocal communication. A lineage that took care of injured group members and, at least sometimes, buried its dead. In that context, the idea that they might also experiment with colour, with ornaments, with marks placed in odd corners of caves, doesn't feel like a leap into fantasy. It feels like a continuation along the same spectrum of behaviours we already see, investing effort into actions that shape not only the physical world, but the social and mental worlds of the group. The real surprise as we turn to the evidence might not be that Neanderthals were capable of symbolic behaviour. It might be how early, how often, and how deliberately they seem to have practiced it. If we're going to argue that Neanderthals were making symbolic marks before our own species showed up in Europe, we can't just point at a red smear on a cave wall and say, "Looks old." We have to put numbers on it. 50,000 years, 60,000, sometimes more. That's where things get both powerful and very, very messy. Let's start with the method people usually think of when they hear ancient dating, radiocarbon. Radiocarbon dating relies on the fact that cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere are constantly turning nitrogen into a radioactive form of carbon called carbon-14. Living things taking carbon-14 along with the normal carbon-12 through breathing and eating. As long as you're alive, you keep topping up that carbon-14. When you die, the supply stops. From that point on, the carbon-14 in your body decays at a known rate, with a half-life of about 5,730 years. Measure how much carbon-14 is left in a piece of charcoal or bone or shell. Compare it to the amount you'd expect in something modern, and you get an age estimate. Calibrate it against tree rings and other records, and it gets even better. But there's a hard ceiling after about 50,000 years, sometimes 55,000 with perfect conditions and cutting-edge equipment. The remaining carbon-14 signal is so weak it's barely distinguishable from background noise. Beyond that, radiocarbon can't tell you whether something is 60,000 years old or 600,000. It just says, older than I can see. That's a problem if the painting on the wall might predate Homo sapiens in that region by 10 or 20,000 years. Radiocarbon isn't going to rescue us there. So archaeologists had to get creative. Instead of dating the paint directly, they started dating the geology that formed on top of the paint, or just beneath it. That led to a quiet revolution. One of the key tools in this revolution is uranium-thorium dating, sometimes just called UTH. Groundwater naturally contains tiny amounts of uranium. When water seeps through limestone caves, it can precipitate thin layers of calcite, those white crusts and drips you see on cave walls and ceilings. The fresh calcite incorporates uranium, but almost no thorium, because thorium is not very soluble in water. Over time, the uranium decays into thorium at a predictable rate. If you drill a tiny core out of a calcite layer and measure the ratio of uranium to its thorium decay products, you can calculate how long ago that calcite formed. In a cave with paintings, that's gold. If a red disc or a hand stencil lies underneath a thin calcite film, then the age of that film is a minimum age for the pigment. The paint has to be older than the rock that formed on top of it. That minimum age idea is crucial. When you hear that a Neanderthal-associated mark in Spain is at least 64,000 years old, what that usually means is the calcite on top is 64,000 years old, so the pigment underneath cannot be younger than that. It might be 65,000 years old. It might be 100,000. We don't know. We just know it's older than the crust. Other methods work in the opposite direction, giving maximum ages. Here's where luminescence dating comes in. Certain minerals, quartz and feldspar for example, accumulate trapped electrons in their crystal lattice when they're exposed to natural background radiation. Sunlight or intense heat can reset that trap to zero by releasing those electrons. Once reset, the clock starts again. The longer the grain sits in the dark, undisturbed, the more trapped electrons build back up. With optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, or thermoluminescence, TL, scientists collect grains from sediments or heated materials, stimulate them with light or heat in the lab, measure the energy released, and calculate how long it has been since they were last exposed to sunlight or fired. In a cave context, that might mean dating the sediments in a layer that underlies a decorated wall, or the last time a mud coating was exposed before someone scribbled on it. If the sediment right under a panel is dated to, say, 70,000 years ago, that gives you a maximum age, The painting cannot be older than the surface that was available to paint on. Between minimum ages from uranium-thorium, maximum ages from luminescence, and the relative ordering of layers, stratigraphy, you start to box in a window of time. Stratigraphy is the oldest dating technique in archaeology, and in some ways the most intuitive. Dirt piles up. Older stuff generally lies beneath younger stuff. If a layer with Neanderthal stone tools is sealed under sediments that date to 50,000 years, and a decorated wall face is clearly associated with that lower occupation level, you can argue that the art belongs to the Neanderthals, not to modern humans who came later. But generally is doing a lot of work here. Caves flood. Roofs collapse. Animals burrow. Humans dig pits. Layers can be mixed, inverted, truncated. What looks like a clean pile of time slices can turn out to be a jumbled mess. That's one of the big pitfalls in all of these methods. Disturbance. Uranium-thorium depends on the calcite layer being a closed system after it forms. No uranium or thorium moving in or out. No later water flow partially dissolving and reprecipitating the same surface. If that happens, your neat decay clock gets scrambled, and the calculated age can be too old or too young. The same holds for luminescence. If sediments are partially exposed to light after burial, say, during a small collapse or from a crack opening, they can lose some of their trapped electrons and forget part of their burial history. Contamination is another constant enemy. A tiny bit of modern carbon can make an old radiocarbon sample appear much younger. A bit of older carbon, say from dissolved limestone, can do the reverse. With uranium-thorium, tiny traces of detrital thorium carried in with dust can make a sample look older than it really is if you don't carefully correct for it. Then there are sampling issues. To date calcite above a painting, you have to remove a bit of it. You want that sample to represent the whole crust, not some weird recrystallized corner. You want to be absolutely sure the crust really does lie directly on top of pigment, not on a later microcrack. At the scales we're talking about millimeters, sometimes less. Small mistakes matter. This is why older dates, especially dates that push behavior into pre-Homo sapiens territory, are so controversial. If a single lab publishes a uranium-thorium age of 64,000 years for a red motif in a Spanish cave, people immediately ask, are you sure that calcite actually post-dates the painting? Is the uranium-thorium system closed? Did you correct for detrital thorium properly? Could the pigment actually be younger, added in a little gap in the crust that you just didn't see? The way the field deals with this is, at its best, slow and unglamorous. Other teams go back to the same cave. They take new samples from different parts of the same motif. They use slightly different chemical cleaning protocols. They try independent methods where possible. Luminescence on the sediments, radiocarbon on associated hearths or torches, careful stratigraphic mapping of every layer and contact. If multiple labs using different equipment and slightly different assumptions keep converging on this crust here is older than 60,000 years, and this motif is definitely underneath that crust, resistance starts to soften. Not vanish, but soften. The claim shifts from wild outlier toward annoyingly plausible. Even then, there's a subtlety that often gets lost when these findings hit the headlines. A minimum age does not tell you when the artist stood there in the dark with a handful of pigment. It just tells you that they did it before a certain time. A maximum age doesn't tell you when they finally made the mark either. It just sets an upper boundary. The true age could lie anywhere inside that window, and sometimes the window is tens of thousands of years wide. This matters a lot when we try to assign authorship. If a hand stencil has a minimum age of 64,000 years, and the best current evidence says modern humans didn't establish themselves in that region of Europe until around 45,000 years ago, the Neanderthal interpretation looks strong. But it's still technically a probability statement, not a mathematical proof. Maybe a small earlier wave of Homo sapiens made it there and left no obvious skeletal remains. Maybe the painting is older than the minimum age by a few thousand years. Maybe our models of human dispersal are off by a bit. In deep time, a bit can easily be 5 or 10,000 years. So what level of certainty is realistic when we're talking about Pleistocene cave art? Not courtroom beyond a reasonable doubt. Something closer to, given the current dating evidence, the regional fossil record, and the known limits of our methods, the balance of probabilities favours this interpretation, but we're open to revision. That may sound unsatisfying, but it's actually what makes this story interesting rather than dogmatic. We're not just discovering that someone somewhere made a red mark in a cave. We're watching in real time as new techniques, uranium, thorium on calcite skins, refined luminescence on cave sediments, ultra-sensitive radiocarbon near its upper limit, reshapes our sense of who could have done it, and when. And once you accept that some of these dates really do push art-like behaviour back beyond the arrival of our own species in Europe, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly are we looking at? Is that red line, that dot, that handprint just a random splash? Or is it part of a whole Neanderthal world of pigments, ornaments, and marks that we're only beginning to see? When people talk about Neanderthal art, 3 Spanish caves show up again and again like recurring characters in a mystery novel, La Pasiega, Maltreviso, and Ardales. They're all very different caves in different parts of Spain, but they share one uncomfortable feature, red pigment that appears to be older than it has any right to be. La Pasiega is in Cantabria, in northern Spain. It's part of a whole complex of decorated caves in that region. Deep inside, on a wall with other motifs, there's a small red ladder-like shape. Vertical line, horizontal bars, abstract but very clearly deliberate. Not an animal, not a human, just this strange little schematic sign. Maltreviso is farther west, near Cáceres. Its claim to fame is hand stencils. You put your hand on the wall, blow or spit pigment around it, and when you take your hand away, you get a negative silhouette. Maltreviso has dozens of these ghostly hands. Some are partial, some overlap, but they are unmistakably human shapes. Ardales down in Andalusia is different again. It's full of stalactites and flowstone formations. On some of those formations, someone, long ago, seems to have applied red pigment in patches and streaks. Not careful outlines, not animals, but dots, washes, and broad swipes of colour following the contours of the rock. If you walked in without any dates, you'd probably file all of this under Late Ice Age cave art and move on. Abstract sign at La Pasiega, hand stencils at Maltreviso, red dotting and smears on the formations at Ardales. We see similar things in later Upper Paleolithic caves that we know were painted by Homo sapiens. But then came the uranium-thorium results. In 2018, a team drilled tiny cores out of the calcite crusts that partly cover some of these motifs. At La Pasiega, they sampled the thin flowstone that overlays the red ladder sign. At Maltreviso, they sampled crusts that sit on top of certain hand stencils. At Ardales, they targeted those red-marked stalactites where pigment clearly lies underneath whitish calcite skins. Remember the trick, date the crust, and you get a minimum age for whatever sits beneath it. The numbers that came back were not what anyone expected. Some of the calcite overlying motifs at these sites gave minimum ages older than 60,000 years. In one case at Maltreviso, the crust covering a hand stencil yielded a minimum age of about 66,000 years. At Ardales, pigment-covered formations produced a cluster of crust ages around the same deep time bracket, with some even pushing toward 70,000. If those minimum ages are robust, the implications are blunt. The pigment had to be put on the wall before that calcite formed. and the best current evidence says that Homo sapiens did not become established in Western Europe until around 45,000 years ago. That's how you get headlines like, "Neanderthals were the first cave artists," and oldest cave paintings made 20,000 years before modern humans arrived. But of course, reality is never that clean. First, look closely at what is actually painted. We're not talking about majestic bison and running horses yet. At La Pasiega, the famous motif is basically a red hashtag without the diagonal lines. At Maltreviso, it's mostly negative handprints and a few dots. At Ardales, the motifs are often just blobs, slashes and stains that appear to follow natural features in the rock. So what are these things? One interpretation is straightforward. These are deliberate, symbolic marks. The ladder sign is part of a repeated vocabulary of abstract symbols found in later caves. The hand stencils are classic "I was here" or maybe "we are here" statements. The red on stalactites and flowstone at Ardales could be purposeful highlighting, someone emphasizing dripping formations or entrances with colour, maybe as part of a ritual. But critics have pointed out that caves are messy environments. Iron-rich water can leave natural reddish films and stains on rock. Microorganisms can produce pigmented biofilms. Mineral crusts can dissolve and reprecipitate in complicated ways. Some of what looks like paint could, in principle, be natural. At Ardales in particular, skeptics argue that some of the red might be the result of water carrying pigment through tiny cracks, depositing it on stalactites from above, rather than a human hand brushing it on from below. If that's the case, dating the calcite over it tells you nothing about human activity. You're just bracketing one phase of mineral growth with another. Others have raised concerns about the uranium-thorium system itself. If the calcite has been partially dissolved and regrown, or if tiny amounts of older detrital thorium were incorporated, the apparent age can drift. It might look older than the true formation age, when the difference between Neanderthal period and Homo sapiens period is only 20,000 years or so. Even a modest systematic error could flip the interpretation. Then there's the possibility of later intrusion. Could younger pigment have seeped into microscopic cracks beneath an older calcite layer? Could a flake have spalled off, been repainted, and then received a fresh, undated skin? At the scale of millimeters, the wall can have a complex microhistory that's hard to reconstruct from a few drill cores. On the other side, the original team and supporters argue that they selected areas where the pigment clearly lies on the surface, and the calcite clearly sits on top, not in cracks. They emphasize that they took multiple samples from each motif, used careful chemical pretreatments to remove detrital thorium, and still got consistent clusters of old minimum ages across 3 different caves. They also point out that the motifs themselves, hand stencils, abstract signs, red dotting of visually prominent formations, fit comfortably within the broader pattern of European cave art. They don't look like random iron stains. The pigment at Ardales, for example, often appears as discrete, thickly applied patches of ochre, not as diffuse wash. So the debate has split along 2 main lines. One line says, the uranium-thorium ages are substantially correct, the stratigraphic relationships are real, and these motifs really do predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Iberia. Therefore, the simplest explanation is that Neanderthals did some form of deliberate marking with red pigment deep in these caves. The other line says, the method is fragile, the samples are few, and the cave environments are too complex to be sure. Without independent confirmation like Neanderthal remains in clear association or replicated dates from multiple labs on the same tiny crusts, we shouldn't rewrite the story of symbolic behaviour just yet. The pigment could be younger, the crusts could be misinterpreted, or rare early Homo sapiens could have passed through earlier than we currently think. Why does it matter so much who held the pigment? Because European prehistory has long been built around a simple timeline. First, Neanderthals with relatively simple stone tools and limited symbolic behavior. Then, around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sweep in with complex art, ornaments, and elaborate technology. If Neanderthals were already making hand stencils and abstract signs 20,000 years before that, the neat narrative crumbles. Symbolic culture would no longer be a package that arrives fully formed with our species. It would be something deeper in the shared human lineage. On the flip side, if further work shows that those Spanish dates are overestimates, or that some of those painted areas are natural, the old story regains some ground. Neanderthals might still have used pigments and decorated objects, but the specific claim of 64,000-year-old cave painting would retreat. So far, the scientific back and forth has been exactly what you'd hope for in a contentious field. New papers publish revised uranium-thorium measurements, or present microscopic analyses showing brush marks and pigment grains embedded in the surface, supporting human application. Other studies re-examine the stratigraphy, or model how water movement could skew uranium-thorium ages, arguing for caution. Nobody has produced a definitive refutation of the old ages, but neither has there been a flood of new caves with equally ancient, unambiguous motifs. We're in that awkward middle zone where some experts say this is probably Neanderthal, others say I'm not convinced, and most quietly admit that the jury is still out. For our purposes, what matters is not that one side wins, but that these Spanish caves have forced everyone to sharpen their questions. When you see a red dot or a hand stencil under a calcite crust, you can't just ask how old is it? You also have to ask, how do we know the crust post-dates the pigment? How did water move? What else could have made this mark? Who was even around to make it? And once you start asking those questions in La Pasiega, Maltreviso and Ardals, you realize you should be asking them in every cave, everywhere. Because even if some of these early dates are eventually revised downward, the red pigments themselves don't vanish. They're still there, still intentional, still part of someone's world. The real mystery then becomes, what did red pigment mean long before there were horses and bison on the walls? What were people doing with colour before they were painting pictures? If you zoom out from those Spanish caves and stop obsessing about whether a particular hand stencil is 64,000 or 44,000 years old, something else pops into focus. Long before there are recognizable pictures on walls, there is colour: red, brown, black, powders, chunks, crusts, little piles of mineral that somebody dug up, carried home, ground down, and used for something. Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Near East keep coughing up the same suspects: ochre and manganese. Ochre is basically iron-rich earth, depending on the exact chemistry and how it's heated. It can run from yellowish to deep brick red. Manganese dioxide is darker, giving you charcoal grey to jet black. Neither of these things is edible. You don't accidentally end up with a cache of manganese lumps in your living area, because you were hungry. Yet that is exactly what we see. At sites like Pech de Lazay in France, Neanderthal layers contain chunks of manganese ore with telltale scrape marks, as if someone was deliberately shaving them down. In Maastricht Belvedere in the Netherlands, there are manganese nodules and evidence of grinding. At sites in Italy, France, Spain, Israel, even as far as Croatia, archaeologists keep finding pieces of iron-rich pigments that have clearly been modified, scored, faceted, ground, or crushed. This isn't a one-off. It's not a single quirky group with a weird taste for rocks. It's widespread, and it's persistent over tens of thousands of years. So why were Neanderthals so interested in these coloured minerals? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly, but the possibilities are fascinating, and they are not mutually exclusive. One very practical idea is that some of these pigments were used for hide processing. If you're turning animal skins into usable leather, you need to scrape, stretch, sometimes smoke or treat them. Iron oxides can help loosen fat and connective tissue. Rubbing ochre into a hide might make it easier to clean and preserve. You end up with a more durable, less smelly piece of clothing or bedding. Another functional use that's often suggested is insect repellent or sun protection. Certain clays and mineral powders can deter biting insects or act as a kind of mineral sunscreen when smeared on skin. Modern hunter-gatherers sometimes do exactly this. A thin film of coloured dust can change how your skin feels to mosquitoes and how it reflects heat. Then there's the fire angle. Some experiments suggest that powdered manganese dioxide, when mixed with charcoal and blown onto embers, can lower the ignition temperature of wood, making fire starting easier. If that holds up, it would mean those black nodules weren't just primitive crayons. They were fire accelerants. Pigments could also have played a role in adhesives. Neanderthals were already using complex glues like birch tar to haft stone tools onto wooden shafts. Adding fine mineral powders can change the texture and performance of glues, making them less brittle, easier to handle, or more heat-resistant. A few grams of powdered ochre in your resin might make the difference between a spearhead that holds and one that snaps off in the first throw. All of these functions are compatible with what we already know about Neanderthals: technically skilled, mechanically clever, experimenting with different materials. But then we hit the more charged possibility: body painting and symbolism. On some Neanderthal sites, the evidence points past pure utility. At Maastricht Belvedere, the amount of pigment seems to exceed what you'd need for a couple of glue jobs. At Pec de Laze, the nodules show systematic scraping that would produce fine powder in quantities large enough to smear on surfaces or on bodies. At sites in Spain like Cueva de los Aviones and Cueva Anton, shells in Neanderthal layers have residues of red and yellow pigment, sometimes mixed with sparkly bits of hematite or other minerals. Some shells look like they were used as little containers or pallets. Put this together with the cave pigments we talked about earlier, and a picture forms. Neanderthals knew how to make and manipulate colour. They collected raw materials from the landscape, transported them, ground them, stored them, and sometimes combined them. That's where grinding stones and so-called pigment kits become important. When archaeologists find a smooth stone slab bearing microscopic striations and embedded red particles, sitting next to chipped chunks of ochre, that's not an accident of geology. That's a work surface, a place where someone regularly took hard, crystalline pigment and ground it into a usable powder. When you see that same pattern repeated at multiple sites, grinding stones plus modified pigment blocks, you're not just looking at random opportunistic smears. You're looking at a production process. Planned production implies planning for use. You don't set up a grinding area, gather raw pigment from kilometres away, and then just shrug and toss the powder. You're making material for anticipated tasks, processing hides, mixing adhesives, decorating bodies, colouring objects, or marking spaces. And that is where colour starts to become social. Colour is visible from a distance. It sits right on the surface of things, on skin, on hair, on clothing, on tools. If some individuals in a group are dusted with red ochre on their faces or arms, while others are not, that difference is legible, even without language. It can signal who belongs to what, who has done what, who is allowed to do what. Anthropologists studying recent societies see colour used over and over as a social tool. Warriors with specific markings, initiates painted a certain way during rites of passage. Married versus unmarried individuals wearing different pigments. Healers, ritual specialists, or leaders distinguished by their colours. You don't need writing for this. You just need a shared understanding that people marked like this are X. Could Neanderthals have been doing something similar? We can't be certain, but the ingredients are all there. controlled pigment production, transport of colorants over distance, association of pigments with potentially special objects like shells and perforated animal parts. The key distinction archaeologists wrestle with is the line between incidental pigment use and patterned, repeated behavior. Incidental use is what happens if you occasionally rub a bit of manganese on a spear haft, because it happens to be nearby and makes your grip a bit rougher. There's no strong pattern, no consistent toolkit, no sign that anyone really cares about the visual effect. Patterned behavior is when you see repeated combinations, the same types of pigments processed in similar ways, turning up again and again in similar contexts across time and space. Grinding stones with red residues in multiple caves. Shells with pigment inside them at different coastal sites. Pigment deposits associated with areas that look like living spaces or special activity zones. Once behavior becomes patterned like that, it implies teaching. Someone has to learn how to recognize the right rocks, how to grind them, how to mix them, when and where to use them. Knowledge starts to travel horizontally between groups and vertically across generations. Color becomes part of tradition, and tradition is a social technology. If Neanderthals were marking their bodies, clothing, or tools with pigment in consistent, socially understood ways, that tells us something profound about their inner worlds. It suggests they cared how they looked to each other, that they engaged in self-presentation, choosing, consciously or not, to appear a certain way in front of others. Maybe red meant adult, or hunter, or marriageable. Maybe black stripes on the arms signaled membership in a particular family, or participation in a recent hunt, or involvement in a ritual. Even if the exact code is lost to us forever, the existence of any code at all would mean they were thinking symbolically about themselves as social beings. It also means they were capable of linking a physical sign, the colour on your skin, the painted shell you wear, to an invisible idea, status, role, identity, memory. That is the psychological bridge you need to get from this rock makes good glue to this mark means something about who I am. So when we look at those early red smears in Spanish caves, or the scraped manganese nodules in French shelters, we're not just cataloguing odd geological finds. We're catching Neanderthals at a moment before pictures, when colour itself was already loaded with possibility. They were learning that the world could be not just used, but styled. And once you start styling bodies and objects with colour, once you realise that you can change how things look, and that other people will react to that, you're only a short conceptual step away from changing how the walls around you look too. From pigment on skin to pigment on stone, from being the canvas to painting one. The next clues that this transition was underway don't come from big heroic murals, but from much smaller things. Teeth, claws, feathers, shells. Objects that seem to have been chosen not just for utility, but for how they looked when worn. Teeth, claws, feathers, shells, all the stuff that if you're a carnivore or a scavenger, you encounter anyway as part of daily life. You kill an animal, you butcher it, you strip the meat, you crack the bones, you toss the rest. But in some Neanderthal sites, the rest doesn't look tossed. It looks curated. Let's start with the raptor talons, because those are some of the most striking. At sites like Krapina in Croatia, archaeologists have found eagle talons in Neanderthal layers that don't match normal butchery. They're not snapped, crushed, or cut in ways that suggest meat removal. Instead, several claws show fine edge modifications, nicks, polish, intentional scraping. In some cases, there are smoothed facets where the keratin has been worn down in a way that looks a lot like something rubbing repeatedly against a cord. There are cut marks in places that don't make sense if you're just trying to eat the bird, but make perfect sense if you're trying to detach the claw neatly from the toe and keep it intact. You don't go through that effort because you're hungry. You do that because you want the claw as an object. The same pattern shows up again in other sites, with different birds of prey, again and again, Neanderthals seem to have singled out the talons and preserved them. Not the meaty bits, not the wings that would be useful as insulation. The claws now. It's possible to imagine purely practical reasons for keeping talons. Maybe they were used as scraping tools, maybe as awls. But there are a couple of problems with that idea. First, the shape of many of these claws isn't great for high-pressure tool use. They're curved and brittle. Second, the wear we see often looks more like polish from rubbing on soft material than microscopic damage from scraping bone or hide. Put that together with their consistent selection from large, dangerous birds, eagles, vultures, and another story becomes plausible. These were ornaments, things that were prized because of what they were and how they looked, not because they scraped better than a flake of flint. You can imagine them strung as a bracelet or necklace, maybe tied onto a strip of leather on the upper arm or sewn onto clothing. When you move, they click softly, flash briefly. Anyone who knows what it takes to bring down a big raptor knows what they mean. That's the key: selection. Ornament use begins when someone looks at the aftermath of a kill and doesn't just see food and waste, but a menu of possible symbols. This tooth, not that one. This claw, not the whole foot. This particular feather, carefully plucked and kept. And we do see feathers, not as clearly preserved as claws, because feathers rot. But there are Neanderthal sites where wing bones from certain large birds show cut marks in very particular patterns, little slices along the bone where the major feathers attach. Not random hacking for meat, but targeted cuts that match feather removal. At Fiumane Cave in Italy, for instance, there are bones from birds with dark, striking plumage, corvids, raptors, water birds, showing just that kind of pattern. The meatiest parts of the bird are untouched. It's the feathers that seem to have been the goal. Why those birds? Again, it's not obvious from a purely dietary perspective. If all you care about is calories, a drab, slow game bird is a better bet than a nervous raven. But if you care about how something looks on your head or hanging from a cord, glossy black or patterned feathers suddenly matter. And we haven't even gotten to the shells on the Iberian coast at sites like Cueva de los Aviones and Cueva Anton. Shells show up in Neanderthal layers that are frankly suspicious. They're perforated in ways that don't look like random breakage. Some have smooth edges around the hole, as if a cord or thong had been repeatedly passed through them. There are accumulations of specific types of shells that aren't the ones you'd choose if you were just collecting for food. Some come from species that live a bit offshore, or in particular microenvironments, implying targeted gathering. Crucially, some of these shells still carry traces of pigment. Red, yellow, sometimes mixed with sparkly mineral inclusions. A few seem to have been used as little cups for pigment mixtures, but others have colour on their outer surfaces as if they themselves were being decorated. Again, this is not about eating. You don't grind ochre and painstakingly smear it into a shell because you're really into seasoning your mollusks. You're turning a shell into a sign. When you see perforated shells with wear around the hole in repeated contexts, that's where archaeologists start using words like beads and pendants. Not because we're picturing perfect little artisan necklaces in a boutique, but because the pattern, selection, modification, transport and wear looks like what you get when people are routinely hanging these things on strings and bodies. And that's the other big piece of the puzzle: transport. Many of these shells and pigments turn up far from the sea, tens of kilometres inland. Sometimes more. That means someone carried them, perhaps over multiple moves, into places where they have zero functional use as food. Every kilometre you haul a shell away from the beach is an investment. That object has weight. It takes up space in your bag or your belt pouch. It's one more thing to keep track of when you're wrangling kids, tools and food. You're not doing that for nothing. So what does this pattern, talons, feathers, shells on strings actually imply? At minimum, it tells us Neanderthals were willing to spend time and energy on things whose value was not directly utilitarian. They invested effort into selecting, modifying, and maintaining objects because those objects mattered in a social sense. Social in what way? That's where we leave the realm of hard data and move into layered possibilities. Ornaments can signal alliance. Matching claws or shells shared between groups might mark who belongs to a wider network. We're the people with eagle talons. We stand together. They can mark age or life stage, only initiates wear a certain colour or feather. They can express skill. The person with multiple raptor claws is the person who can bring them down. They can signal grief. A pendant made from the tooth of a lost child or partner, worn as a portable memory. They can encode membership in smaller units, families, lineages, bands. Even in recent human societies with no writing, strings of shells or teeth can carry dense information. You see someone at a distance and, just from their ornaments, you know roughly who they are, where they come from, and how you should treat them. If Neanderthals were doing anything like this, then adornment was communication. It doesn't require language to work, but it does require shared codes. You and I both have to agree, implicitly or explicitly, that this kind of object worn this way means this kind of thing. That's symbolism. It's a step beyond this rock is sharp into this claw stands for that idea. Of course, the evidence isn't always crystal clear. One of the running battles in this field is over whether a given modification is really intentional or could have been produced by natural processes, roots etching bone, rocks tumbling shells, predators gnawing talons. Sometimes what looks like a perforation under field conditions turns out, under a microscope, to be a boring by a marine organism or a crack from pressure. Archaeologists respond by looking for patterns. Is the hole in the same place on multiple shells of the same species? Are there microscopic cut marks radiating from it that match stone tools? Are there polished patterns consistent with rubbing against soft fibres? Do we see similar arrangements in clearly later, clearly symbolic contexts? The more of those boxes are find ticks, the harder it becomes to dismiss it as an accident. And this is where ornaments quietly reframe the entire conversation. When the debate was just, could Neanderthals paint? It was easy to imagine them as technically adept, but symbolically limited. Maybe, the argument went, they could make glue, shape stone, manage fire, but pictures on walls, that's a mental leap too far. Once you add personal ornaments into the mix, especially in contexts older than or contemporary with early Homo sapiens art, the question shifts. It's no longer did they have the motor control to dab pigment on a surface? Of course they did. They were making birch tar, hafting tools, stringing beads. The real question becomes, what did these modifications stand for in their minds? If you're wearing eagle talons and pigmented shells, you're already participating in a symbolic system. You're making choices about how you present yourself to others. You're aware, at some level, that other people see you and evaluate you. You care enough about that evaluation to decorate your body. That's self-awareness rooted in a social world. You're not just an organism reacting to cold and hunger. You're a person moving through a web of expectations, reputations, and identities. The objects you carry and wear are part of how you navigate that web. Personal style, in this deep time sense, isn't about fashion the way we think of it now. It's about visible signals in small groups where everyone knows everyone, but still needs tools to express roles, histories, and ties that aren't immediately obvious. So when we hold a perforated shell from a Neanderthal layer, we're not just holding a little piece of calcium carbonate. We're holding a trace of that invisible social code. A fossilized decision to take something beautiful or dangerous or rare, modify it, and tie it to a human body. And once bodies start carrying symbols, walls are not far behind. The same mind that can turn a claw into a sign worn on the chest can turn a scratched line into a sign marked on stone. To see how that next step may have played out, we have to look at some very humble evidence, not dramatic animal scenes, but simple, deliberate lines. Marks that, taken seriously, might be the earliest surviving statement scratched into the world. Imagine you're in a rock shelter waiting out bad weather. The fire's going, you've got time. In your hand a sharp flake of stone, the same kind you'd use to butcher an animal or scrape a hide. In front of you a flat bit of bone or a chunk of soft limestone. Now imagine that, for reasons that are not about food or tools, you press that flake down and drag it. Once, twice, again. Carefully enough that the lines cross at angles or run parallel or trace a rough ladder shape. You stop, look, maybe add one more stroke to balance the pattern. Then you put it down, fast forward tens of thousands of years. Archaeologists dig that piece out of the ground and stare at the scratches. Are they just random damage? Or did someone like you sit there and make them on purpose? That's the puzzle with engraved objects in Neanderthal contexts. They're small, they're subtle, but if even a fraction of them are intentional, they change how we think about what kinds of marks counted as meaningful long before horses and bison galloped across cave walls. Take the famous case from Gibraltar. At Gorham's Cave, in a layer attributed to Neanderthals and dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, researchers uncovered a patch of bedrock on the cave floor, crossed by a set of intersecting, deeply incised lines. Not random scratches running every which way, but a sort of hashtag on steroids, 8 long grooves, crisscrossing in a grid-like pattern. If you glance at a photo, it's tempting to see what you want to see. A symbol, a hashtag. The world's oldest tic-tac-toe. But archaeologists don't get to leap that fast. They have to show that a human made it deliberately. So they went forensic. Under a microscope, they examined each groove. They looked at the cross-section of the lines. Were they V-shaped like cut marks from a stone tool, or U-shaped like natural abrasion? They checked whether tiny ridges and striations inside the groove all lined up in the same direction, which would indicate a controlled motion, not random scraping. They reconstructed stroke order which lines cut across which. The superposition told a story, one horizontal stroke, then another, then a vertical crossing them, then a diagonal. A sequence. Then they tried to replicate it. They took similar stone tools, pressed into fresh bedrock with different amounts of force, and compared the resulting grooves. Light pressure gave thin, shallow scratches. To get the same depth and crispness as the Gorham's lines, you had to lean in hard, repeating strokes along exactly the same path. In other words, this wasn't something you'd accidentally do by dragging a tool absent-mindedly. It took intention, strength, and repetition. You had to want those lines. Gorham's isn't alone. At sites like La Ferracie and Pech de Lazay in France, and at a couple of Italian caves, bone fragments from Neanderthal layers bear sequences of straight, parallel incisions, all oriented in the same direction, spaced more or less evenly. Some shells and bits of soft stone show radiating or ladder-like scratch patterns. On a shell from Cueva de los Aviones, the same site with the pigmented shells, a set of deliberate lines runs across the surface in an arrangement that doesn't fit normal butchery or opening techniques. At Keek Koba in Crimea, a fragment of animal bone carries a series of short, grouped cuts, each group separated by a tiny gap, as if someone was marking off units. Again, the argument isn't, this looks nice, therefore it's art. The argument is in the details. Under high magnification, researchers look for microscopic flake scars along the edges of each line, which tell you a sharp edge was dragged through once, twice, 3 times. Consistent angles of attack. If every groove enters the bone at roughly the same angle, with the same twist of the wrist, you're likely looking at a single maker repeating a motion. Patterning in space. If you draw a line through the centers of each cut, do they line up? Are the distances between them roughly regular? Random damage doesn't care about spacing. Hands do. Stroke order. If one set of lines consistently sits on top of another, you're dealing with layering. Someone made one motif, then complicated it with more. The more of these checks a piece passes, the more comfortable specialists become in saying, okay, this was not just an accident of butchery or trampling. Someone sat and engraved. But what were they doing? This is where the stakes jump, because these aren't pictures of animals or people. They're abstract marks, lines, grids, chevrons, crosses. The kinds of things that in much later contexts we might call tally marks or geometric motifs. And it turns out that in the very deep past, abstract marks are far more common than anything figurative. There are reasons for that. First, abstraction is cheaper. If you want to sketch a recognizable horse, you need practice, time, and a clear mental template. If you want to cut 5 short lines to stand for 5, or score a cross to stand for "this is mine," you need only the idea and the motor control. The cognitive demand is different. Second, abstract marks are flexible. The same set of parallel lines can be counting kills, or marking days, or tagging ownership. A simple cross might be a clan sign, a memory anchor for a story, a ritual seal on a place. You don't have to agree that this looks like X, as long as you agree that this configuration means Y. Third, abstraction is durable. Natural processes can chip away at a rough animal sketch until it's just noise. But deep straight grooves crossing at right angles, those survive. When we look back across 50,000 or 100,000 years, what we're most likely to see are the things that were easiest to make and hardest to erase. So archaeologists are increasingly treating these humble engravings as the deep-time backbone of symbolic behaviour, with fancy paintings as the late, showy cousins. What might Neanderthal engravings have meant? No one knows, and anyone who claims certainty is overreaching. But a few broad possibilities keep coming up. They could be counts, notches made as you process carcasses, tallying how many animals were killed on a hunt, or how many hides are owed, or how many days until some expected event. In later human societies without writing, tallies on bone or wood are everywhere. They could be marks of ownership or identity, a repeated motif scratched on a tool, a piece of personal gear, or a favoured spot on the cave wall that says, in effect, "This belongs to me," or "This is associated with our group." Think of them as deep-time logos. They could be memory aids or teaching tools, a set of lines used as prompts in storytelling, or as a way to walk a child through basic counting, shapes, or sequences. When you don't have writing, you lean heavily on external anchors that help you remember and explain. They could be ritual traces, lines cut as part of a repeated act, before a hunt, after a death, at the start of a season. The precise form might matter less than the fact that it's the same form, done the same way, every time. They could be some combination of all of the above, varying from person to person, group to group, generation to generation. The risk, of course, is that once you open the door to meaning, you can project anything you like into those grooves. This is why analysts are careful, sometimes painfully so. If an engraved object is a one-off, or if the marks could plausibly be explained as by products of scraping meat or cutting tendons, most specialists will set it aside or mark it as ambiguous. They're wary of what's sometimes called the reindeer effect, seeing a beautiful cave painting of a reindeer, then assuming every faint stain nearby is also intentional art. To avoid that, they set strict criteria. Marks should be in places that don't match normal butchery zones. They should run in directions that make no sense for slicing meat or detaching skin. They should show consistent patterning, similar spacing, angles, orientations across multiple specimens or sites. Researchers also look for repetition through time. If in independent sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, you start seeing the same basic geometry, parallel lines in groups of 4 or 5, ladder motifs, nested chevrons. It becomes harder to wave it away as chance, especially if these motifs only appear once you hit layers associated with particular hominin groups and technologies. That repetition is crucial because repeated geometry implies more than just a bored individual doodling. It suggests planning. To reproduce a motif, you have to hold an image or sequence in your mind across time. You have to know before you start that you're going to make 4 lines, not 3. That they're going to cross this way, not that way. That the pattern matters. It suggests tradition. If multiple individuals are making similar marks generations apart, the recipe for those marks must be travelling socially, taught, imitated, maybe even corrected. Someone cares that you scratched it the right way, and it suggests that some abstract configurations of lines have become meaningful in a way that outlasted any single person. That's the quiet revolution hiding in these scratches. When you move from a unique, unrepeatable act, I felt like making a line here once to a standardized motif that shows up again and again. You've crossed a threshold. You've shifted from pure motor play into a shared code. You're building a little piece of a symbolic system. And where do you put symbols that matter? On things that move with you, like ornaments, tools, bones, and on places that matter, like particular rocks and walls. Which brings us back into the dark. Because once those abstract marks start creeping from portable objects onto the fixed architecture of caves, the whole environment becomes available as a medium. A wall is no longer just a wall. It's a surface where lines can carry ideas forward in time. To see how Neanderthals might have used those surfaces, not just scratched them, but chosen, revisited, and transformed them, we have to step deeper into the caves themselves, into places where light barely reaches and sound behaves strangely, and ask a different question. Why make marks there? If you're going to scratch a symbol onto something, doing it on a loose bone by the fire is the cheap option. Doing it deep inside a cave is the opposite. Imagine what it actually costs. You can't just stroll in there at noon and trust your eyes. Sunlight dies almost immediately once you turn a corner. Beyond the entrance zone, you are in engineered darkness. Every step of visibility has to be paid for. Gathering resinous wood, making torches, tending fire, maintaining hearths so they don't choke you with smoke in a confined space. Torches burn out. They drip. They throw sparks. They eat oxygen. You have to know how long a bundle of pine or juniper will last. How many you need to get in and back out without suddenly standing in silent, absolute black. You also have to navigate. Caves are trap mazes. Side passages, sudden drops, narrow squeezes where you have to angle your shoulders just right, or you're stuck. Pools of cold water that will soak your fuel. Fissures that vanish into blackness far below. It only takes one misstep to break an ankle, one rock fall to close the exit. So anyone going more than a few meters inside is taking a real risk. Not an abstract one, we might die down here risk. That's the starting point for archaeologists when they look at deep cave activity. It's costly. In time, in material, in danger, and in prehistory, you rarely pay big costs for no reason at all. So when we find evidence that Neanderthals didn't just poke their heads in, but repeatedly went deep underground, and that they made marks in those spaces, it forces the question, what was worth that much trouble? The first clue is the fire. Cave walls don't just have ochre smears and incised lines. They have soot. In a number of European caves with probable Neanderthal use, places like Bruniquel in France, Nerja in Spain, and several Iberian sites associated with those puzzling early pigments, the ceilings and upper walls are streaked and blackened in ways that don't match a single accidental blaze. Hearths appear in layers. Charcoal lenses build up. Burnt bones are scattered around. Radiometric dating on stalagmites and calcite drips that formed over some of these fire traces suggest time ranges on the order of tens of thousands of years, with activity clustering in particular windows. In some deep zones, you have stacked fireplaces, one hearth laid partly on top of another, each with its own scatter of flint fragments and ash. That's not a one-off expedition. That's a place that has become a destination. And it's not just about light. The sensory world inside a cave is alien compared to the surface. And that matters because human brains are very sensitive to context. Change the environment. You change how thoughts and experiences feel. Start with the dark. Even with a torch, you don't get clean daylight. You get a halo. Everything outside that circle plunges into velvety black. Peripheral vision largely shuts down. The world narrows to whatever the flame licks across your companion's faces looming out of nothing, a patchy wall, a bit of ceiling dripping far above. The light itself moves. Torches flicker. They gutter in drafts, flare when you lift them, dye corners in red and gold, then snuff them out again. Anything drawn or carved on the wall doesn't appear as a static image, the way it does in a museum catalogue. It shimmers. Lines that look simple in full light can ripple in and out of view. Animate with shadows. Sound transforms too. Most caves mess with acoustics in ways our ancestors would have noticed immediately. Whispers can carry. A cough can bounce back at you from invisible directions. In narrow passages, noises are muffled and deadened. In larger chambers, claps and shouts explode into layered echoes that stagger and overlap. Modern sound mapping in some painted caves shows that certain decorated panels happen to sit right where the acoustics are strangest spots, where a voice from one direction sounds like it's coming from another, where a drumbeat sets up resonances that vibrate in the chest. We can't prove that Neanderthals were consciously picking good echo spots. But when you see the same pattern, marks and pigments clustering in acoustically distinctive chambers rather than randomly spread, you start to suspect this wasn't just about finding any old patch of wall. Then there's the physical feel. Humidity is high. Temperatures are steady and cold. The air is often still, then suddenly gusty when it squeezes through narrow cracks. Your skin prickles. Your nose picks up smells differently. Wet stone, torch smoke. Maybe the tang of bat guano. Maybe the lingering scent of earlier fires. Taken together, this isn't just a different backdrop. It's a sensory technology. By going underground, by choosing a space where light, sound and bodily sensation are all distorted, you're stepping into a kind of natural theatre. Any action you take there, speaking, singing, scratching a wall, smearing pigment, lands differently than it would outside. So how do Neanderthal traces fit into that stage? Look at where things cluster. Near cave mouths where daylight still reaches, you tend to find practical stuff. Stone tool debris, butchered bones, evidence of short-term shelters. These are the zones where it makes sense to work hides, carve tools, roast meat while still benefiting from the cave's shelter without committing to the depths. Deeper in what archaeologists sometimes call the twilight zone where outside light dies but you're still near the entrance, you sometimes see activity that's ambiguous, stash points, occasional hearths, one-off marks. But when you push into true darkness, places that absolutely require artificial light to navigate, the pattern shifts. In those zones, you usually don't see piles of domestic debris. You don't see trash middens or the typical signatures of day-to-day living. Instead, you get isolated hearths, deliberately placed stone structures, and marks positioned in specific, often memorable spots. At Brunichel, for example, Neanderthals broke stalagmites and stalactites, dragged the broken pieces into a deep black chamber, and arranged them into circular and linear formations. They lit fires on and around these structures. No sleeping areas. No heaps of discarded food. Just constructions and flames in a place so far from the entrance that getting there is an expedition in itself. Even in less spectacular caves, engraved or painted areas sit at places you could easily remember and point to later. At a bend in the passage, on a prominent projection, above a natural altar of jutting rock, or opposite a resonant niche that throws your voice back at you. This is where people start talking about caves as stages. Not necessarily stages for individual artists in our modern sense, but for collective acts that involved multiple people repeated over time. Think about making a set of marks by torchlight in a chamber like that. You're not quietly doodling while everyone else sleeps. Other people had to help you get there. Someone is carrying extra torches. Someone is tending the fire while you work. Kids might be watching. Another adult might be guiding the flame so shadows fall just so across the rock. The making of the mark becomes a social performance. Everyone present sees that this particular spot has been singled out. They witness the sequence of strokes. Maybe there are words that go with it, a chant, a story, an explanation, or maybe the act itself is enough, repeated every time you return. From this perspective, those lines and smears are not just communication to the future. They're communication in the present. They say, we were here, together, doing this thing, in this place again. And that's one of the reasons archaeologists are increasingly skeptical of the lone genius model for early cave marks. In small Pleistocene groups, nothing about going deep underground is solitary. Travel is risky. Redundancy keeps you alive. If someone twists an ankle in a crawl space, they need others to haul them out. Fire carrying and wayfinding are shared responsibilities. So when we see repeated use of a specific deep chamber over centuries, with accumulated soot, hearths and marks, it's more plausible to imagine a tradition in which the group goes to the cave than an isolated individual sneaking off to make art. Participation could take many forms. Some people might be the ones who know the route through the dark. Some maintain the fire, some handle the torches, some may be specialists, maybe just whoever is chosen that day actually score or paint the walls. Children might touch the rock, echo the movements, learn where to stand and how to behave. The marks, from this angle, are less about a signature and more about a chorus line, evidence that the cave itself was a gathering point for patterned behaviour. And once you see that, the contrast between zones starts to matter even more. A scratch on a bone by the hearth outside might be a private tally, a personal reminder. The same motif dragged into existence on a wall in a deep, echoing chamber that only certain people ever visit, under controlled light, accompanied by shared attention, could carry a very different weight. The physical context, the risk, the sensory strangeness, the collective effort just to stand there amplifies whatever meaning those lines already had. In other words, the cave is not neutral. It's part of the message. An entrance mark might say, in effect, we were here. This is a good place. A deep mark might say something like, we came here, into the underworld, to do this special thing. Not in words, but in the very fact of its placement. Later Homo sapiens almost certainly exploited the same logic. The great painted caves of Upper Paleolithic Europe are textbook examples of turning underground space into ritual theatre, narrow, dangerous access routes, delivering people into chambers of sound and flickering images. The controversial twist in the Spanish caves is that some of the simplest marks and pigments in those deep spaces may predate our species in Europe. If Neanderthals were already using dangerous sensory-charged chambers as stages for repeatable acts involving marks and fire, then the roots of that cave theatre go deeper in time than we used to think. And that pushes us toward a different kind of question. If the cave is a stage, and the group is the audience and the cast at the same time, then those abstract, non-figurative marks are not just decorations. They're props in a performance. What kind of performance can you run with lines, dots, and smears? To answer that, we have to look more closely at the meanings that can live in symbols that don't look like anything at all. You don't need a horse on a wall to have a symbol system. In fact, if you look across human cultures, some of the most powerful, tightly regulated symbols are the ones that don't look like anything in the natural world at all. Lines, grids, spirals, knots, beads in particular sequences, cuts on a stick. None of them are pictures in the way a bison or a handprint is. Their power comes from something else: repetition, shared understanding, and the social agreements that grow around them. Anthropologists sometimes talk about symbols as social contracts. Not contracts in the modern written sense, but in the sense of shared expectations. When you see this, you act like that. Everyone in the community doesn't just recognize a mark, they recognize what it obligates them to do. Think about a modern stop sign. It's not a picture of a car stopping. It's just a red octagon with letters on it. Take away the letters and the shape and colour alone still work, because enough people have agreed that this specific combination means you, driver, must do this very particular thing now. The power is not in the shape itself. It's in the fact that everybody treats the shape the same way. Now roll that idea back 60,000, 100,000, 200,000 years, strip away written language and cities and paved roads, and you still have the basic building blocks. Small groups moving through landscapes they know intimately, needing to coordinate with relatives and neighbours they don't see every day. In that kind of world, even a very simple mark can carry a lot of weight. A cluster of vertical lines at the mouth of a reliable spring could be a claim. This water source is under the protection of such and such group. A repeated motif scratched at the edge of a hunting ground could be a warning. Beyond here, you're entering someone else's territory. Be careful. Inside a cave, the same logic could apply at different scales. A particular configuration of dots or crosshatches near a dangerous drop might function as a rule. Do not go past this point unless you're with someone who knows the way. A repeating V-shaped motif around a favoured deep chamber might signal this is a place where we do that thing, whatever that thing happens to be in their cultural world. Notice that none of this requires those symbols to represent animals, spirits, or people in any literal picture-like way. They are not attempts to capture the visible world. They are attempts to shape behaviour. This is where the idea of marks as social contracts gets interesting. Once a motif is established in one place, you can start moving it. Scratch the same pattern on a piece of bone or antler and carry it with you. Reproduce it on the side of a rock shelter 2 days' walk away. Carve it into the lintel stone of a favoured overhang. Every new instance of the symbol recruits the old social meaning and drags it along. In small, scattered populations like Neanderthal groups, that kind of portable contract could help stitch a landscape together. It might help define who could camp where, who could harvest which shellfish beds, which routes through the mountains were ours versus theirs. It could function like a silent, persistent version of a conversation that otherwise has to happen face to face. And those contracts need not always be hostile. A particular mark at the entrance to a shallow cave near a river crossing could serve as an invitation. This is a known place. If you arrive and we're not here, you can still rest, maybe leave something in return. The same way some ethnographic hunter-gatherer groups treat certain trees or rock shelters as neutral meeting points. Marks can also encode sacred rules. Don't touch this. Only certain people may pass beyond this point. When you enter this chamber, you must behave this way. Again, we're in the realm of probability and analogy, not proof. We can't read a Neanderthal wall the way we read a medieval inscription. But once you understand that non-representational symbols in many cultures function less like paintings and more like traffic signs and ritual boundaries, those simple lines and dots stop looking trivial. They look like the surface of a deeper system of social expectations. Then there's memory. If your world is oral, no writing, no books, then remembering complex stories, migration routes, family histories, and ritual sequences is a major cognitive task. One of the ways humans solve that problem is by tying information to places. Walk through many traditional landscapes today, and people can point to a rock, a tree, a waterfall, and say, "That's where such and such happened." The story is anchored to the location like a mental tag. You don't carry the story in isolation. You carry a route, and the route cues the story. Abstract marks can intensify that effect. A set of incised lines at a particular bend in a cave passage can serve as an anchor point. This is where we tell the story about the winter we almost didn't survive. A dot cluster beside a stalagmite might be the place you pause to recite the names of ancestors. The mark is not the story. It's the handle you grab so you can pull the story up. You can think of it like a primitive memory palace. Instead of an imaginary building in your mind, you have a real cave. Instead of mental furniture, you have concrete details. This rock, that crack, those flickering scratches that each summon a piece of narrative when you reach them in sequence. Some researchers have suggested that certain repeated Paleolithic motifs might even function as proto-notation, tally marks for seasonal cycles, animal migrations, or life events like births and deaths. It's tempting to see a row of 13 lines and jump to lunar calendar, or to look at recurring marks near salmon-rich rivers and imagine this is when the fish return. Those ideas are not ridiculous. In historic foraging societies, people absolutely track seasonal rhythms with marks on wood, bone, or rock. But we have to be careful. Without direct ethnographic continuity, it's almost impossible to know whether a specific cluster of scratches under a dripstone is counting moons, counting hunts, or just following the shape of the rock because it felt right under someone's hand. What we can say is that the potential is there. Once you start repeating a motif in an orderly way, spacing lines evenly, stacking groups of dots, arranging shapes in sequences, you're halfway to some kind of notation system, even if it's local, informal, and tightly bound to one group's tradition. And that brings us to repetition and convention. If you strip away our modern obsession with beauty and masterpieces, what makes a mark into a symbol isn't how pretty it is. It's how reliably people use it and recognize it. A messy, wobbly cross that everyone in a community agrees is the funeral sign is a stronger symbol than a gorgeously rendered animal that has no shared meaning beyond, "Wow, that looks cool." In the prehistoric record, we see this logic play out. Certain abstract motifs, ladder-like grids, branching lines, clusters of dots, show up again and again across different sites and time periods. Sometimes they're in caves with spectacular figurative art. Sometimes they're in boring shelters with nothing but scratches and a few lumps of pigment. Their repeated presence suggests convention. Somebody taught somebody else that this was the right way to make this sign. People learned to produce it in a consistent way. That kind of conventionality is what you'd expect from a symbol system, not from random doodling. Neanderthal contexts, where we see similar non-figurative marks in multiple caves within a region, hint at these same processes. Not a full-blown writing system, not even necessarily a standardized Neanderthal alphabet, but pockets of local convention where a particular group used a particular pattern in recognizable, repeatable ways. And that's the sting in the tail for us. Because symbol systems like this can be intensely local. They can be bound to a valley, to one network of families, to a handful of generations. Their meanings can shift over time. A mark that starts as a warning might become an emblem of identity. A tally might acquire mythic significance. The same motif might be adopted by newcomers and woven into a different story. Fast forward 60,000 or 100,000 years, and all of that context is gone. The oral histories that explained the mark never got written down. The last people who knew exactly what those scratches stood for died without passing their explanations to anyone whose descendants we can interview. What we're left with are the traces of the contracts, not the contracts themselves. We can infer that certain motifs mattered because they were repeated. We can see that they were placed in meaningful spots. We can guess, using comparisons with historic hunter-gatherers, at functions like boundary marking, invitation, taboo, memory cue, or timekeeping. But the precise content, where the 3 lines beside a niche in a Spanish cave meant "do not enter," only at midwinter, here we remember the dead, or something we don't even have a category for. That level of meaning may be gone for good. And that's not a failure of archaeology. It's a reminder of what symbols actually are. They're not just shapes on rock, they're agreements among living brains. When the brains disappear, the agreements dissolve, and the leftover shapes become puzzles we can approach but never fully solve. Yet even in that uncertainty, one thing is clear. If Neanderthals were making non-figurative marks in consistent, socially charged contexts, then they weren't just leaving random scratches. They were participating in the same kind of invisible contracts that govern symbolic behavior in our own species today. They had rules about where to mark, when to mark, and what the marks did in their social world. And once you grant them that level of symbol use, another possibility opens up. If these shapes could regulate territory, memory, and ritual, they might also have played a quieter role, weaving Neanderthal worlds together with ours, signalling contact, alliance, or difference when the 2 species finally met. To see how those abstract systems might have overlapped or clashed, we have to step out of the caves for a moment and look at what happens when different kinds of humans start sharing the same landscapes. When those different kinds of humans finally did start sharing landscapes, it didn't happen all at once, everywhere. It was messy, stop and start, spread out over tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals had been in Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before any Homo sapiens showed up there. Our own species doesn't really push into those territories until around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, and even then, it seems to come in waves. In the Levant, the strip of land we now call Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, there are hints of earlier encounters. Fossils and tools suggest that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens took turns occupying some of the same caves between roughly 120,000 and 80,000 years ago. Think of it like a doorway region. Climates shift. One group expands in, conditions change again, the other group returns. Farther west in Iberia, modern Spain and Portugal, the overlap seems to stretch from around 45,000 to maybe 37,000 years ago, depending on which dating you trust. In some pockets of southern Iberia, Neanderthals may have hung on even longer, while Homo sapiens groups were already painting caves just a few hundred kilometers away. In Central and Eastern Europe, the picture is different again. The earliest modern human layers show up around 45,000 years ago. Neanderthals disappear from those regions a little bit later, but not instantly. For a few thousand years, the maps you'd draw from the fossil and tool record would show a patchwork. Some valleys probably dominated by Neanderthal groups, others by incoming Homo sapiens, with broad contact zones in between where the 2 populations could meet. And meet here is not a polite one-time handshake. We know they interbred, that's not speculation. That's written into your genome if you have ancestry outside of Africa. Between 1 and about 4% of the DNA in most non-African populations today is Neanderthal in origin. A few specific gene variants related to things like immune responses, skin physiology, maybe even susceptibility to certain diseases, can be traced back to Neanderthal donors. Geneticists can even pick out distinct episodes of interbreeding. It doesn't look like one brief fling and then everyone goes their separate ways. It looks like repeated contact events in different places over thousands of years. But they had sex is not the same as they shared everything. Interbreeding tells us that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens saw each other as potential mates at least some of the time. It implies physical proximity and probably some degree of social contact, enough to negotiate pairings, however those were arranged. It does not, by itself, prove that they merged cultures, swapped stories, or sat down to co-design art traditions. For that, archaeologists go hunting for something more subtle, patterns that look like ideas moving. One big question is always, when you see a new style of tool or ornament in Neanderthal layers, is that independent invention? Or did they pick it up from Homo sapiens neighbours? And the mirror question. When you see Neanderthal-like techniques in early Homo sapiens sites, are we looking at copying, cohabitation, or just convergent problem solving? Take stone tools. Neanderthals developed sophisticated, prepared core techniques long before we appear in Europe. Later, in some so-called transitional industries, names like Châtel-Perronien in France and Spain, you suddenly get a mix of things. Classic Neanderthal core technology, plus new blade forms, plus ornaments and pigments that look a lot more like what turns up in early Homo sapiens contexts. One reading is cultural transfer. Neanderthal groups at the frontier, seeing what the newcomers are doing, long blades, personal ornaments, perhaps different hunting strategies, and selectively adopting some of those techniques. Another reading is independent innovation under shared pressure. Two intelligent species facing the same cold, unstable environments, both pushed in similar technological directions. How do you tell the difference? Archaeologists look for sequences. If a decorative style or tool type clearly appears first in one population's territory, and then later, with slight modification, in another population's territory, and we know from fossils or genetics that those populations overlapped in time and space, diffusion becomes a good bet. Shell beads are a classic case. We see pierced shells being used as personal ornaments by Homo sapiens in Africa, long before our species reaches Europe. Later, in some Neanderthal-associated layers in Iberia and France, we also find shells collected from the coast, sometimes pierced, sometimes stained with pigment. Did Neanderthals invent shell jewellery on their own? Possibly. Or did they see Homo sapiens using shells as markers of identity or status and decide, consciously or unconsciously, to play the same game, maybe with their own twist on style and colour? Pigments tell a similar story. Neanderthals were using ochre and manganese dioxide before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, likely for body decoration, hide processing, or both. But in a few late sites, the way pigments are prepared, mixed and applied starts to resemble practices in nearby Homo sapiens contexts. More complex mixtures, carefully ground powders, multiple colours associated with the same occupation layer. That pattern, local tradition, plus new elaborations is the kind of thing researchers flag as probable cultural contact. Still, probable is as far as we can go, because the archaeological record in these contact zones is noisy. Sediment gets churned by animals, water, and later human use. Charcoal drifts. A few centimetres can represent hundreds of years. You can end up with a layer where Neanderthal stone tools, Homo sapiens ornaments, and mixed pigments all sit together, and you have to ask, is this a true snapshot of shared life? Or a palimpsest, a stack of separate occupations smushed into one confusing sandwich? Authorship becomes a persistent headache. In a cave where you have clear Neanderthal presence and clear Homo sapiens presence and abstract markings on the walls, which hands made which marks? If the scratches are sealed under a layer of calcite dated to 65,000 years ago, and the only hominins in the region at that time were Neanderthals, the answer is pretty straightforward. But in later, transitional layers, where both species might have used the same cave at different times, or even alternated seasonally, a red smear of pigment or a new cluster of lines is much harder to assign. This is where symbolism and identity come back into the story. Contact zones don't just move technologies, they intensify signalling. When another human group shows up on your horizon physically different, speaking strangely, using their own ornaments and marks, you suddenly need to say very clearly, we are us and we are not them. One way to do that is through visible symbols: beads, pendants, feathers, scars, paint patterns. Another is through the designs you fix in places that matter: cave entrances, special chambers, prominent rocks along travel routes. Some researchers suspect that the boom in personal ornamentation and distinctive styles of tools around 45,000 to 35,000 years ago reflects exactly this kind of identity race. Not just I am a person, but I am that kind of person, from that kind of group, broadcast in a world where several kinds of humans are now potential allies, enemies, or in-laws. If Neanderthals already had their own local symbol systems, and Homo sapiens arrived with theirs, those systems might have reacted like chemicals in a solution. Some motifs could diffuse across the boundary and be adopted by both species. Others might sharpen into markers of difference. We wear this kind of bead, they wear that kind. The frustrating part is that our evidence for this process is always indirect. We see a new ornament type appear in a region where two human species overlap, and we say, this looks like contact. We see shifts in pigment use or engraving styles and talk about possible cultural transfer. But we can't sit at the mouth of a Pleistocene cave and watch two families, one Neanderthal, one Homo sapiens, arguing, flirting, trading, and silently judging each other's necklaces. And in the cave art itself, that uncertainty becomes almost poetic. A row of dots in a chamber used by both species might be a purely Neanderthal mark that Homo sapiens later ignored. It might be a Homo sapiens addition to a Neanderthal landscape. It might be a shared motif adopted and reinterpreted by each side, its meaning negotiated in ways we'll never reconstruct. What contact zones give us, then, is not a clean story of Neanderthals teaching us art, or Homo sapiens enlightening Neanderthals, but a tangle of possibilities, independent invention running alongside imitation, rivalry prompting more elaborate displays, alliances leaving faint, hybrid traces in ornaments and marks. In that tangle, one question looms over everything else in this debate. When we see early non-figurative art on European cave walls, are we looking at the last flowering of a Neanderthal symbolic world, the first experiments of incoming Homo sapiens, or some entangled blend of both? To get any closer to an answer, we have to stress test the evidence itself, how we date it, how we assign it, and what other explanations might still be on the table. So let's stress test it. Anytime you hear a claim like Neanderthals were making art 20,000 years before us, your internal skeptic should sit bolt upright and start asking rude questions. Archaeologists do the same thing. And the first question they throw at those Spanish cave markings is very basic. Are we even sure these are human marks at all? Cave walls are not blank canvases waiting for us. They're dynamic, messy surfaces. Water seeps through the rock, dissolving minerals, redepositing them as flowing veils and drip lines. Iron and manganese oxides creep and bloom like rust. Roots push in from above, etching delicate, branching patterns as they grow and decay. Bats and bears and cave lions have all left their own signatures, claw marks, rubs, patches of disturbed sediment. Some of those processes can produce things that look eerily like deliberate designs. Mineral-rich water can create neat red streaks, spots and halos. Root etching can leave fine wavy lines that might, at a quick glance, pass for engravings. Animal claws dragged down a soft wall can produce parallel grooves that look like someone scraped a tool across the surface more than once. So one skeptical line goes like this: maybe some of these Neanderthal motifs are just geology and biology doing their thing. The little red ladder-like figure? A very lucky mineral run. The lines fanning out across a wall, root traces, the dots. Natural iron nodules exposed as the surface eroded. Researchers counter by drilling down into the details. Natural flows tend to follow gravity. They run, smear, pool. They don't usually stop, start, and change direction in ways that line up with each other. Root etching spreads in branching networks. It doesn't typically arrange itself into repeated, evenly spaced strokes. Animal scratches tend to have characteristic patterns too, curved arcs at about paw height, or clusters near entrances and ledges where animals would have climbed. In the contested Spanish caves, a lot of work has gone into showing that the pigments sit on top of the rock, rather than being part of it, that they follow paths consistent with brush or fingertip application, that some strokes overlap others in planned sequences. Under magnification, you can sometimes see microscopic striations where a tool has dragged grains of pigment across the surface, something roots and water don't do, but often is not always. There are marks where the distinction is clear and others where it isn't. And skeptics are right to point out that if even a small fraction of supposed art turns out to be natural, we have to be extremely cautious about building big stories on the rest. Then there's the second major front, the dates themselves. The famous early Spanish examples use uranium-thorium dating on thin calcite crusts that formed over the pigment. You measure how much radioactive uranium has decayed into thorium in that crust, and you get a minimum age. The pigment has to be older than the crust sitting on it. That minimum age is the key phrase. If the crust is 64,000 years old, the red mark beneath it could be 65,000, or 100,000, or 5 minutes older. It just has to predate that calcite layer. So critics ask, how sure are we that the crust and the paint are related at all? Could the pigment have been added long before when we don't really know who was around? Could the crust have grown in patches, leaving open windows where later humans snuck in and added new paint that just happened to end up under a dated flake? There are more technical worries too. Dating tiny crusts means working with very small samples. That increases the risk of contamination from younger or older calcite. Water flowing through a cave can dissolve and redeposit uranium and thorium, resetting the radiometric clock in weird ways. If you accidentally drill into a complex, multi-episode crust and treat it like a single event, your age estimate can be skewed. Add to this the problem of sampling bias. Researchers can't date every pixel on a wall. They choose spots where there is visible crust, where the crust is thick enough to sample without destroying the motif, where the lab methods will work. That means the early dates we have might represent a very particular subset of marks, those in positions favourable to calcite growth, not necessarily those that were most important to the artists. So the skeptic says you're building a sweeping claim on a handful of carefully chosen spots, and a method that has edge cases. Slow down. And then comes the thorniest problem of all, attribution. Even if a mark is definitely human-made, and definitely older than 60,000 years, we still have to ask, which humans? For a while the story was simple. Homo sapiens didn't get to Europe until about 45,000 years ago. Anything older than that in a European cave must be Neanderthal. It was a nice clean line. Then hints of earlier Homo sapiens presence started popping up, not in those exact Spanish sites, but around the edges of Neanderthal territory. Teeth, bones, tools that might push our species in and out of southwestern Eurasia in little waves before the big expansion. The dates are debated, the fossils fragmentary, but they crack open a possibility that small groups of Homo sapiens could have wandered into regions we traditionally label Neanderthal, left a few traces, and either died out or withdrew. Caves themselves are rarely used just once. A chamber might be occupied by Neanderthals at 80,000 years ago, then abandoned, then revisited by some early Homo sapiens group at 70,000, then later by more Neanderthals, then much later by farmers, monks or tourists. Sediments slump. Burrows and water channels mix layers. You can end up with a puzzling superposition. Classic Neanderthal tools in one lens, modern human artifacts in another, and a red mark on the wall that's been quietly aging through all of it. So another skeptical argument says, how can you be sure that a particular mark was made during a time when only Neanderthals were present? Maybe it belongs to one of those brief, poorly attested Homo sapiens incursions we haven't fully mapped yet, or even to some still unknown cousin species. This is where methodological safeguards matter. To even begin to address these doubts, researchers layer defences, blind analysis. One team documents and classifies the marks without knowing the dates, to avoid wishful thinking creeping into interpretation. Independent labs replicate the uranium-thorium measurements on different crusts from the same motif, or apply other dating methods, like radiocarbon on associated charcoal or optically stimulated luminescence on nearby sediments to cross-check the timeline. Geomorphologists study the cave's growth history, how water has flowed, where calcite tends to form, how often surfaces get refreshed. Microscopy specialists look for clear evidence of tool contact or pigment layering. Stratigraphers re-excavate old sites with modern methods, trying to untangle mixed deposits and tie wall marks to specific occupation phases. None of this makes the case bulletproof. But it does mean that the strongest Neanderthal art candidates are not just we saw some red stuff and like the story. They're marks that have survived several rounds of skeptical attack. And that skepticism is not a nuisance, it's the point. If the claim is true that Neanderthals were making deliberate, symbolically meaningful marks on cave walls tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens did anything similar in Europe, it rewrites how we think about mind, culture, and what it means to be us. You don't want that resting on a misidentified root stain or a misdated calcite scab. So what kind of evidence would really move the needle? Stronger and more numerous, direct dates on pigments themselves, using new micromethods that can pull radiocarbon from tiny organic binders in the paint would help. Clear sequences where a Neanderthal occupation layer, with diagnostic tools and perhaps bones, is directly associated with a fresh, datable marking event. Sites far from any plausible early Homo sapiens presence that still show the same structured motifs. And ideally, repetition, comparable Neanderthal-age markings turning up in multiple regions with similar themes or layouts, pointing to shared conventions rather than one-off doodles. On the flip side, the case would weaken if new finds pushed Homo sapiens securely into those exact regions, in those exact time windows, with clear evidence of pigment use and marking. Or if reanalysis showed that key early dates were actually measuring older underlying calcite, not the crust on top of the paint. Or if microscopic work demonstrated that some of the most cited designs really do follow natural fracture lines, root paths, or mineral channels, stripping away our best examples and leaving only ambiguous scraps. Right now, we're in the uncomfortable middle. The Neanderthal art hypothesis has survived its first serious stress tests, but it hasn't crushed the opposition. The best skeptical arguments don't force us to abandon the idea. They force us to refine it, to narrow which marks we really trust, and to be honest about the gaps. And once you've done that, once you've filtered out the roots, the claws, the questionable dates, the messy layers, you're left with a smaller, sturdier set of Neanderthal marks that most critics agree are at least plausibly intentional. Those are the ones worth listening to. So what, if anything, were they trying to say with them? That's where we go next. If we take that cautious, filtered set of marks seriously, if we allow that at least some of them are deliberate, placed with intention by Neanderthal hands, the obvious next question is the dangerous one. What did they mean? We will never know in the way you know what your text messages mean. There is no Neanderthal Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription that says, "This red ladder symbol equals Clan of the Western Valley." But we're not totally helpless here either. We can triangulate from patterns from what humans and other social animals do with marks and ornaments, and from the kinds of situations that make symbols useful. When you line all that up, A few big themes keep coming back. One of the strongest candidates is identity and belonging. Think back to those pigments on bodies, those pendants, those recurring shapes on cave walls, in small scattered populations, where you might go months without seeing another group. Knowing who is us and who is them isn't just a philosophical question. It's survival. One possibility is that Neanderthal groups were using colour and simple motifs as group badges. Maybe a particular red hue meant people from this valley. Maybe a specific arrangement of lines, 3 vertical strokes, a dot, another stroke, was a kind of clan signature. Not writing, not phonetic language, but a stable visual convention you could recognise at a glance. That fits with what we see in many hunter-gatherer societies. Scarification patterns, bead combinations, feather styles that signal birthplace, kin group, marriage status. You don't need a city or a state to invent style codes. You just need social boundaries and the need to manage them. So one reading of those marks is quietly political. A way of saying, we were here. We are this kind of people. If you know what this means, you know where you stand with us. A second big cluster of ideas points toward ritual and the sacred. Those deep, awkward cave spaces, the ones you don't just stumble into while grabbing some firewood, are weird choices for casual graffiti. You have to commit to getting there. You have to bring light, negotiate tight squeezes, watch your footing, and then, in the dark where the world feels thinner and stranger, you leave a mark. Anthropologists use the term liminal space for these in-between zones. Thresholds, cave mouths, river crossings, places that feel like boundaries between realms. Across cultures, they're where you get rites of passage, ancestor offerings, initiation ceremonies. They're places where you do things for someone or something that is not physically there. So another interpretation is that Neanderthals were using pigment and engravings to highlight those liminal spots. A dot series on a protruding rock might mark a door to the underworld. A handprint near a drop-off might have been part of some gesture toward ancestors, or spirits or mythic beings that lived in the stone. We cannot say which story they told, but the decision to go somewhere dark and risky and repeatedly place marks in similar positions looks a lot like behaviour we much later call ritual. And ritual is a way of making ideas sacred, of tying memory and identity to specific places. Then there's a third possibility, which isn't really separate from the others, the practical symbolic blend. Humans almost never do pure practicality. We decorate our tools, we name our cars, we carve initials into the handles of hammers. Functional objects pick up symbolic weight, and there's mounting evidence that this was already true hundreds of thousands of years ago. Some Neanderthal marks could have started as very down-to-earth aids. A set of notches at a cave junction might help you remember which passage leads back to the entrance. A particular motif near a good sleeping area could warn, "This is already claimed," or "Danger beyond this point." A simple arrangement of dots might be a game score, or a tally of how many animals were taken at a particular hunting stand. But once you have a conventional mark, once everyone agrees, consciously or not, that 3 dots in a row means something, you've opened the door to layering. The same 3 dots can be a trail marker, a property claim, and a little invocation of good luck, all at once. Kids grow up seeing them and associate that pattern with successful hunts, with elders' stories, with particular people. Over generations, the practical instruction can blur seamlessly into tradition. No one remembers exactly when the first marks were made. They just know, this is what we do here. Function and meaning fuse. That brings us to something people often underrate when they talk about serious prehistoric art, aesthetics and play. Not everything that matters has to be solemn. Watch children with mud, or teenagers with spray paint, or bored adults with a pen and a notebook margin. The impulse to make marks, to vary colour, to experiment with patterns, is built deep into primate brains. It's exploration and play, but it's also practice. It's how you develop the fine motor skills and eye-hand coordination you later use for hunting, tool-making, surgery, or violin. So it's very plausible that some Neanderthal cave marks began as experiments. Someone discovers that grinding a certain rock makes a vivid red. Someone notices how the pigment changes under torchlight. Someone figures out that if you drag a tool this way, you get a sharp line. That way, a soft smudge. They play. Those experiments aren't trivial. They're how you discover new techniques. They're how a child copies what an older sibling did, and in the process reinforces group style. They're how skill gets displayed, the way a good throw or a clever joke gets social credit. A particularly neat pattern or difficult placement, high up on a wall, in a dangerous niche could absolutely be a flex. And finally, there's a kind of meaning that only appears once you zoom out in time. Communication across generations. When you carve or paint on something stable, stone instead of skin, a cave wall instead of a stick, you're implicitly betting on the future. You're acting as if someone will see this later, not necessarily a stranger. Maybe your future self, maybe your children. In small, mobile groups, that kind of durable mark can keep a story anchored. This is where your grandfather was buried. This is the cave where we sheltered in the great winter. These are the signs our people make. Even a simple motif can be a memory trigger. It doesn't have to encode the whole story. It just has to be enough that standing there years later with someone younger beside you, you can point and say, "See that?" That's when, in that sense, some Neanderthal marks might be less like messages to unknown others and more like bookmarks for their own oral histories. Physical hooks you can hang words on so that the story doesn't drift too far with the seasons and the generations. All of these possibilities, identity signals, ritual marks, practical guides, playful experiments, time-spanning reminders, don't compete. They can pile up. The same red motif could begin as a playful smudge, become a hunting tally, turn into a clan marker, and end up wrapped in myth about the first ancestors who painted their blood on the stone. By the time archaeologists see it, tens of thousands of years later, all those layers of meaning are collapsed into one stubborn patch of pigment, and even within a single lifetime, meanings shift. What an elder treats as sacred, a teenager might approach as a challenge or an opportunity to innovate. What one group sees as a boundary marker, another might treat as a welcome sign or a puzzle to imitate. So when we ask, what were they trying to say? The most honest answer is probably, more than one thing, not always the same thing, and not always what we would say with the same marks. But even that cautious answer already pushes us into uncomfortable territory. Because if Neanderthals were playing with identity, with ritual, with memory and communication across time, then we're not looking at mindless paint smears on a cave wall. We're looking at the early rumblings of the same symbolic storm that would later sweep through Homo sapiens caves in France and Indonesia. And that brings us to the bigger question. If Neanderthals were doing this tens of thousands of years before our own famous cave paintings, what does that do to our story about modern human minds? For a long time, the standard story went something like this. Humans like us were stumbling along for a couple 100,000 years, doing fairly simple things with fairly simple minds. Then, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, boom, a cognitive revolution. Suddenly there's art, complex tools, elaborate burials, long-distance trade. The curtain goes up, culture explodes, and we become truly modern. Neanderthals in that script were the control group. Strong, capable, but mentally stuck in an earlier mode. No real symbols, no real art, no deep time perspective. Close, but not quite us. Neanderthal pigments, ornaments, and cave marks, especially the ones that now seem to predate our own famous cave art by tens of thousands of years, take a match to that script. If a different human species is deliberately using colour, marking special places, decorating bodies, and maybe even organizing space in caves with repeated motifs, then symbolic thinking is not a late-breaking superpower that appears out of nowhere in one lucky branch of Homo sapiens. It starts to look like something else entirely. It looks like a capacity deeply rooted in our shared ancestry, something that was already smouldering long before there were modern humans in the textbook sense, something that Neanderthals inherited and developed in their own way, in their own environments, on their own timeline. That has two big implications. First, it undercuts the idea of a single magic threshold, the moment when pre-human minds flip into human minds. Instead of a cliff, you get a slope. Instead of a bright line, you get a gradient. Second, it opens the door to convergent evolution inside our own lineage. Because even if some symbolic capacity was already present in the common ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, that doesn't mean both groups used it in exactly the same way, or to the same extent, or for the same purposes. The basic neural hardware might be similar, but what you build with it can still be shaped by your world. Imagine two related families inheriting the same toolkit. One lives in icy, seasonal Europe, the other in varied African ecologies. They both have fire, stone, language, social bonds. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they each start solving problems in parallel, but not identically. Both groups discover that marks and colours can track identity, guide movement, encode stories. Both develop rituals, maybe myths, but some of the details could have emerged independently, tuned to their specific environments and histories. That's convergent evolution, not between birds and bats or dolphins and sharks, but between closely related human species carrying similar brains into different worlds. If that's what we're seeing, then the so-called cognitive revolution is less like an invention and more like a tipping point in visibility. The mind doesn't abruptly change, the record does. Populations get denser, materials preserve better, techniques snowball faster, so suddenly the archaeological traces of symbolic life go from faint and scattered to overwhelming. Neanderthal art nudges us toward a spectrum view. On one end you have very simple modifications, a preference for certain pigments, a few scratches on a bone that might be nothing, or might be the first step toward treating a surface as a place where marks can accumulate. Move along the spectrum and you get repetitive motifs, body decoration, occasional special burials, simple spatial organization in caves. Symbolic practices that matter deeply to the people doing them, but leave ambiguous traces that are hard to pin down from a distance of 60,000 or 100,000 years. Further along still among later Homo sapiens, you finally get the full fireworks, polychrome paintings, crowded story scenes, complex ornaments, regional styles, objects that clearly exist only to carry meaning. In that picture, Neanderthals aren't the failed branch with no symbols. They're somewhere in the middle of the same long ramp we're on. Maybe slightly ahead of us in some areas at certain times, slightly behind in others, but part of the same gradual build-up of symbolic traditions. That's a humbler, messier story, and it forces some restraint in both directions. Because if Neanderthals were on that ramp with us, we still have to face the huge areas of ignorance. We do not know what their sentences sounded like. We don't know how many distinct words they had, or how they structured grammar, or whether they told stories with past and future tenses the way we do. We don't know their myths. We don't know who their heroes were, what monsters haunted their nights, what they thought happened after death. We don't know whether a three-line motif on a wall corresponded to a specific tale, a spirit, a taboo, or a joke. We don't even know how internally coherent their symbol systems were. Maybe some motifs were part of a widely shared code, recognized for hundreds of miles. Maybe others were intensely local, or even personal. One individual's favourite mark copied a few times by their friends. The archaeological evidence can tell us that marks exist, that they cluster in certain places, that they co-occur with other behaviours like burials and pigment use. It cannot, on its own, decode entire mental worlds. So we're left walking a narrow path. On one side is the old arrogance. They were just copying us, or they were doing something simple and instinctive that only looks symbolic. On the other side is a new temptation. They were exactly like us in every deep way. They painted like we do, prayed like we do, thought like we do. The honest position is more uncomfortable. Neanderthals were capable of symbolic acts that look in structure and in context, very much like the early stages of the symbolic storm we later unleash. But the detailed content of those symbols is gone. We see the scaffolding, not the stories. This is where the pace of new discoveries matters. Every time dating techniques improve, even just a little timelines wobble. A motif that looks safely modern human turns out to be 20,000 years older. A pigment layer once written off as contamination turns out to be purposefully placed. At the same time, more sites are being found, and older collections are being re-examined with fresh eyes and better tools. What used to be one or two strange anomalies are becoming patterns. That means any neat chronological wall we build between their symbolism and ours is always at risk of being knocked over by the next radiometric date or microstratigraphy study. And it isn't just caves and bones. Genetic work keeps sharpening the picture of who was where, when they met, and how much they exchanged, not just genes, but probably ideas. Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped for thousands of years in multiple regions. Some of those ornaments and pigments might come from contact zones where styles and meanings were being traded back and forth. In the middle of all that scientific recalibration, there's also a quieter ethical recalibration. How we talk about Neanderthals isn't just an academic issue. It shapes how we think about us and them more broadly, about which minds count as fully human, which lives are seen as capable of meaning. Dismissing Neanderthals as dull, artless brutes is easy. It makes us feel special. It turns them into a convenient foil in a self-flattering story. We're the only species that ever really mattered. But romanticizing them is dangerous in a different way. It's tempting to turn Neanderthals into projections of whatever we miss in ourselves. Noble eco-warriors, perfectly egalitarian cooperators, mystical cave sages with secrets we've lost. That's just a different kind of erasure, replacing their reality with our fantasies. Respect, in this context, looks like something harder. It means taking their capacities seriously, acknowledging that they thought in symbols, navigated complex social worlds, and left traces meant to outlast their own lives, without pretending we can speak for them. It means admitting that a mind can be genuinely human, genuinely rich, and still be different. Not a failed version of ours, not a carbon copy of ours, but its own branch on the tree, overlapping in many ways, diverging in others. And it means being willing to let our own story shrink a little. If Neanderthals were making art like marks in deep caves before our species ever painted Chauvet or Lascaux, then the moment we became human is not ours alone. The roots of whatever we call humanity are tangled. They run back through multiple species, through bottlenecks and migrations and quiet experiments with colour in the dark. By the way, if you want to dive much deeper into this whole bottleneck to art story, the book version of this research is out now at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. It gets into even more of the side branches and weird cases we can only glance at here. For now, though, we're left with this. Neanderthal symbols don't just add a quirky footnote to human prehistory. They force us to redraw the whole chart of what counts as a modern mind. Instead of a lone peak, Homo sapiens suddenly soaring above everyone else, we get a range of high plateaus. Different human species, at different times discovering that marks can hold memory, that colour can carry identity, that places can be thick with story. Some of those lineages end, ours doesn't, so we get to tell the tale. But when we stand in a dark cave, looking at an inexplicable red mark made by someone who died 60,000 or 100,000 years ago, we're not just looking at our beginning. We're looking at one of several beginnings, parallel attempts to do the same strange thing, to make thought visible, to bind time with symbols, to push meaning into the future. And that realization quietly changes the question. It's no longer just, when did we become fully human? It's also, how many different ways did being human once exist? And what does it mean that most of those ways are gone, but their whispers are still on the walls? Those whispers are where we'll end. If you strip away all the technical arguments, all the uranium-thorium dates, the microstratigraphy, the pigment analyses, the comparative anatomy, you're left with something almost disarmingly simple. A stain of red on a wall that doesn't have to be there. A cluster of lines on a protruding rock that someone could have ignored. A cache of pigment, carefully ground and stored in a place where no one lives. None of these things were necessary to eat or sleep or not freeze to death. They're extra, they're surplus, they're about something. And that aboutness is the heart of the mystery. Because once you accept that at least some of these Neanderthal marks and colours are deliberate and repeated, and the evidence for that is getting stronger every year, you have to ask, what kind of world produces minds that do this? Maybe those red patches in Spanish caves were route markers, guiding people through treacherous underground spaces. Maybe those engraved lines on stalagmites and bones were tally marks, or clan signs, or ways of marking ritual zones. Maybe pigments on shells and feathers turned bodies into moving canvases, broadcasting status, kinship, or readiness for some ceremony. Or maybe some of it was quieter, a hand running the same pattern over stone again and again because it felt right. A favourite motif someone insisted on adding wherever they went. A way of saying, I was here, and this place mattered to me, even if no one ever saw it in the dark. The strongest evidence strands all point in the same direction. We see repeated use of specific pigments, especially reds and blacks, across large spans of time and space. We see those pigments appearing in contexts that suggest planning. Shells perforated and stained, bones smeared and deposited, cave areas selectively marked while other surfaces are left blank. We see engravings and abstract motifs that recur in multiple sites, often placed in locations that would require effort and risk to reach. We see overlap in timing between Neanderthal occupation layers and these traces, and in some cases, clear separation from the later arrival of Homo sapiens. Taken together, it's very hard to maintain the old picture of Neanderthals as utterly non-symbolic. At the same time, the uncertainties are huge. Some dates still have wide error bars. Some pigments really are probably just incidental iron-rich water seeping through rock, manganese staining a surface. Some marks might be functional in a way we don't yet understand, related to butchery or tool-making, rather than meaning for meaning's sake. And even when we're confident that something is symbolic, the content is almost entirely opaque. We don't know if a red dot meant this is sacred or danger, drop ahead, or this is where the bison spirits live, or this is the third station in a coming-of-age ritual we can't even imagine. We don't know whether a repeated motif was part of a shared rule-bound system, a kind of visual language, or whether it was more like a fashion trend, spreading casually from group to group. We don't know if everyone in the band understood the marks the same way, or if some knowledge was restricted, kept by elders or by certain families, or by people with specialized roles. We don't know if there were stories attached to these places that were told every time the group gathered there, or only once a year, or only when someone died. What we do see, faintly, is a pattern that feels familiar. Special places revisited, special materials singled out, special gestures repeated. That's the architecture of meaning. And it looks less and less like something that burst into existence with us alone, and more like something that several branches of our family were building in parallel, so we're left with a kind of double vision, On one level, Neanderthals are profoundly alien. They lived in ecosystems we've never experienced. They organized their families in ways we can only guess at. They navigated predators and winters and diseases we've never known. Their symbolic worlds, whatever they were, are closed to us. On another level, they're painfully close. They buried their dead sometimes. They carried ornaments, they chose colours. They went deep into the dark to do things that did not need to be done for survival. They stood in front of walls and changed them. If you zoom out far enough, the differences between their marks and ours blur. What's left is the shared move, to make a trace that outlives the hand that made it. That act, marking time, marking place, pushing something of yourself into the future, is one of the threads tying our whole genus together. So here's the question I want to leave you with. The next time you walk past a piece of graffiti under a bridge, or a heart carved into a tree, or a memorial covered in names, or even your own notes taped to a fridge, what if you thought of those Neanderthal marks? What if you saw them all as points along the same continuum? Attempts to resist erasure, to insist that a moment, a person, a group, a story doesn't just vanish. If Neanderthals were already playing with that power, already using colour and line to thicken certain places with memory, then the human story isn't just about one clever species inventing art. It's about multiple ways of being human, all groping toward the same strange solution, making meaning durable. And that leads to another, quieter question. When you look at those ancient marks, do you feel more alone in time or less? Because there's a version of this story where the gaps and uncertainties make the past feel closed off, forever unknowable. And there's another version where the very fact that we can't decode their meanings forces a different kind of kinship. We don't know what they were trying to say, but we know that they were trying. And in some sense, that might be the oldest whisper in the dark we can still hear. Not the literal content of their symbols, but the shared impulse behind them. A hand reaching out across an impossible distance, leaving a trace for someone else. If you want to explore more of those prehistoric secrets, the bottlenecks, the migrations, the pigments in the dark, the book that this episode draws from is out now. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. It goes much deeper into the side stories and borderline cases we could only skim here. For now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you in daylight, on a commute, doing dishes at midnight, lying in the dark with headphones on? Drop that in the comments and tell me which part of the Neanderthal art story stuck with you the most, or what you're still skeptical about. Those comments really do shape what we explore next, and they help other people find these long, weird journeys into deep time. If you found this episode thought-provoking, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. In a way, that's its own modern version of leaving a mark on the wall, a tiny action that tells the algorithm and us that this story was worth carrying a little further into the future. Thanks for listening, wherever and whenever you are. And the next time you see a line of paint or a carved initial in some forgotten corner, maybe pause for just a second. You and a Neanderthal, separated by 60,000 years, might have more in common than either of you ever meant to say.